civil society organization to draft the East Africa Civil Society Organizations Bill, which is intended to protect civil society in the region. However, we can only make progress if we speak the same language and work together to continue pursuing the East African dream. As the East Africa Law Society, ladies and gentlemen, we pledge our commitment towards this discussion and thank the Kenya Human Rights Commission for this initiative. I look forward to the deliberations and wish you fruitful discussions. Thank you again. Asanteni sana.
Thank you, Mr. Bernard Ounda, for those wonderful remarks. Our next speaker is Dr. Bernard Mogesa. Dr. Bernard Mogesa is the CEO of the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. Bernard is a passionate and visionary leader who within the span of 7 years has risen within the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights ranks from the head of public education and training to head of research and compliance and to deputy commissioner, commission secretary, and now the commission secretary. A teacher by profession, Dr. Mogesa began his career as a high school principal employed by the Teacher Service Commission in 1992 before venturing into his call for working on and learning with others, learning with others on disability rights. Dr. Bernard, karibu.
Thank you very much, Martin, and all the protocols observed. First of all, allow me to thank KHRC for planning this very important conversation on safeguarding human rights in East Africa, and of course, reflecting on the functionality of the critical community organs and institutions. First of all, we need to reflect, for example, on matters around access to justice. How have we strengthened, for example, the institutions within East Africa? And if you allow me to use the Kenyan example, especially surrounding the controversy of appointment of judges, which those in Kenya, for example, know. For almost 2 years, this remained a very, very thorny issue, and therefore that, in a way, compromised, access to justice, for the Kenyans. Moving away also from that resource aspect, even, oversight institutions like the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, you are very much aware that it is now 2 years since the exit of the previous commissioners, and we do not have commissioners in place yet. So when you look at these oversight institutions, and it could happen also, in other countries within the region. So in a way that compromises, access to justice, playing, around the mandates of those institutions. The second point, again, around these institutions is with regards to financial resourcing. And again, using the Kenyan example, where, for example, the court, the judiciary is underfunded, and you have to see, the Chief Justice raising these concerns about resourcing. And actually, this runs across even the oversight institutions, including the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. And I have to disclose here, for instance, that we do not receive any support from government with regards to our programs. And remember, this is very, very core. It is provided for in our Act. It is provided for in the Constitution. And therefore, if we do not receive funding for programs, then it means that we are not able to implement our mandate. The third point which I wanted to mention is that issues around impunity, for example, and total disregard, especially around the court orders, are quite rampant in Kenya, and this actually compromises the enjoyment of human rights across, board in the Republic. And I have a sense of feeling that impunity runs across, the East African region. And I think as we address these core issues today, we need to reflect on how do we, as practitioners, as institutions, then face the challenge, of impunity. And my third last point regards to the, structural engagements with the duty bearers. And I have a sense that the shrinking civic space, for example, has not allowed key players, civil society organizations, to engage with the key duty bearers in enhancing, access to justice and enjoyment of human rights. So again here, taking the Kenyan scenario, we need to think about how do we confront that, shrinking civic space in the country. How do we allow, fair play by all the organs, be they private, be they civil society organizations? How do we ensure that the human rights defenders, for instance, who raise concerns, who raise issues around human rights violations, are actually protected and not victimized as it is, the case today? And then my last point, which I really want to engage on, is when we have, human rights concluding observations to our countries, how are these concluding observations from the Human Rights Council, from the various instruments, taken into account? To what extent are they implemented? And are the states then therefore reporting as they are required? So if we confront all these issues and we have a fair play, I'm quite confident that the enjoyment of human rights within the East African region will be moved to another level. Those are the points I wanted to mention, Martin. For now, I had quite a lot of points, but I think because of time, allow me to hand over the mantle back to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mogesa, for those wonderful remarks and those points of reflection that I'm certain we'll all ponder on. And now I want to call on my colleague, Annette Nerima, who will introduce the next speakers. Annette, karibu.
Thank you so much, Martin. My name is Annette Nerima again, and I'll now have the pleasure to welcome the next speaker. The next speaker is Mr. Maurice Tayebwa. Mr. Maurice Tayebwa is currently the Principal Political Affairs Officer at the East African Community. He is a graduate student of Health Promotion, Education and International Development, and he is interested in public health, education, gender equality, poverty alleviation, social protection, and community development. Mr. Maurice Tayebwa, you have 5 minutes to give us your opening remarks. Welcome.
Annette, if I may, sorry, colleagues, Maurice seems to have dropped off the line. Probably, we humbly request you introduce the next speaker as we try to get him back online. Apologies for that.
Okay, thank you. We'll get hold of him once he's back. Thank you. So we'll move next to Mr. Zain Abubakar, who is the former legislator at the East African Legislative Assembly. Mr. Abubakar Zain Abubakar is one of the founding directors of the Oracha Collective, which combines artistry, activism, and analysis in its facilitation of intellectual work with civic, community, and academic institutions. He is a committed Pan-Africanist. He has served as a member of the East African Legislative Assembly, where he chaired the parliamentary committee. Mr. Zain Abubakar, karibu. You have 5 minutes to give your opening remarks.
Thank you very much for your kind and generous introduction. Greetings from Nairobi, all protocol observed. Like the colleagues who have spoken before me, I will try to be precise because I have only 5 minutes. So I would like to speak to the design and architecture of organs of the East African community, and specifically talk about the East African Court of Justice and YALA, the East African Legislative Assembly, and connected matters in terms of practice. So to give a historical context, one of the major issues that led to the collapse of the first East African community was its design had allocated a lot of power in the executive, in the heads of states, of the partner states. So in the architecture of the new, which is the current East African community, there was commitment to disperse powers through the various organs. There were attempts, and specifically in terms of the East African Court of Justice and the Legislative Assembly, they have a modicum of autonomy, but there are still challenges. In terms of practice, let me start with the East African Legislative Assembly. I think many commentators have pointed out that we may need to elect directly members of the East African Legislative Assembly. Currently, they are elected indirectly through the national assemblies of partner states. So electing them directly will give them a connection to the people and an accountability line to the people. Currently, their accountability is to their National Assembly formally, but informally, they are also accountable to their governments and their parliaments. We also need to give them financial autonomy. As we speak now, both the Assembly and the court, the clerk of the court and the clerk of the Assembly are given donated power to oversee the accounts of these two important institutions. And this donated power is donated by the Secretary General of the community. So they have sub-accounting status. This does not give them freedom and independence. So we need to establish a separate, distinct fund for each of these institutions. Thirdly, we need to also pay attention on how we appoint judges to the East African Court of Justice. Currently, what happens is that the treaty provides for a partner state to use its municipal powers of appointment, similar to the judges that they appoint in the partner states. And of course, there is reference to academic standards, integrity, and so on. But you will see that in a country like Kenya, where the constitution has altered the executive powers in nominating judicial officers, and there is an independent judicial service commission, which competitively hire through advertisement and interviews and public participation. That process is not followed in the community. Let me make last 2 points. The first one is that we have a mechanism in the East African community that monitors and evaluates elections in the community. At the beginning, the Legislative Assembly used to appoint its own members to do this work. This was changed now to allow other stakeholders within the community, for example, representative of civil society, representative of human rights commissions, but fundamentally flawed is the requirement of nomination of partner states representatives. And my experience has been that this partner states representative will always seek a safer path of not calling the elections the way they are. They would have a standard classical template which says there may have been challenges here and there, but in the end, it reflected the will of the people. The last point I would like to make, like the others who spoke before me, is to say that the trajectory of our region is that there is a growing authoritarianism. And this growing authoritarianism, partly we can counter this by establishing strong and independent institutions. And the East African community organs and institutions need strengthening, and we need to reduce the overreach powers of the summit, which is made up of the heads of states of the East African community. And then last is to say that there are certain parts of the treaty that have not been operationalized. So for example, Article 146 and 147 that deals with the questions of how to suspend a member state or expel a member state when they violate the treaty have never been given the protocols that would allow for those two important mechanisms of accountability to be operationalized. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Mr. Abubakar, for the powerful insights. We seem to have lost Maurice Taevwa, and so we'll proceed to the next session. But before then, I just want to take this special opportunity to thank our development partners, including OSF, Open Society Foundation, for the support that they've given us as KHRC to also to enable us be able to be here today and deliberate on this powerful topic. I want to welcome Mr. Lawrence, Commissioner Lawrence Mute, who will take us through the next session. And in introducing him, I want us to know that Mr. Lawrence Mute is currently the lecturer at the University of Nairobi School of Law. He has also been a former commissioner at the Kenya National Human Rights Commission, and also a former special rapporteur on the freedom of expression and access to information from the at the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. I know he's held so many dockets. I would not be able to exhaust that right now, but I want to take this special opportunity to welcome him to take us through the next session. Karibu sana, Commissioner.
Thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by greeting each one of you and welcoming you to this convening. I have a number of responsibilities this morning, but I think the first thing I need to do is explain the context. So the concept, the context for this convening, which the Kenya Human Rights Commission is doing. Now, I think as the director has already indicated, KHRC is doing this project, which it has titled Defending the Independence and Functionality of the East African Community and its organs. And I think just to highlight some of the objectives of the project, the project aims to further public discourse on the importance of independent human rights mechanisms within the East African community. It also seeks, the project, to sensitize stakeholders on the threats to the East African human rights system, and then also to mobilize civil society organizations towards a public campaign supporting the East African community and its organs in asserting the institutional and functional independence. So that really, in a sense, this convening is one of the elements of this mobilization of the overall work, which then KHRC intends to undertake in the next couple of months. Now, in terms then of the why, what exactly does this project entail? I should say that there's a basic premise here. And this basic premise, the basic premise of the project is that effective and functional regional economic communities are essential for purposes of realizing the promotion and protection of human and people's rights. Now, so again, what we are saying is that the integration agenda of the East African community necessarily has to include the promotion and protection of human and people's rights. And actually, you can look at a number of things from the continental level, the sub-regional level, and obviously to the country level, which sort of then underpin this premise. For example, you look at Agenda 2063, which articulates a collective vision under which African states have prioritized democracy, a good governance and respect for human rights, justice and the rule of law as essential ingredients for the continent's transformation towards inclusive and sustainable development. You also look at the sort of platforms which the African Union has put in place to support the recognition by African states that realizing the aspiration, which is the Agenda 2063 aspiration, requires establishing strong, capable institutions that provide transformative leadership at all levels. And I particularly make reference to the African governance architecture, which is established in such a way that then it becomes this consultative platform where states, the regions, and other stakeholders can meet and have discussions and do things. I can also cite the African Human Rights Strategy, and I'm sure colleagues, those of you who work in this area, would know, the sort of strong messaging around integration, which is again set out in the African Human Rights Strategy. Now, I want to stress two other points in terms of this undergird to the premise which we are working with. That actually, regional economic communities play important mediating roles in ensuring that states implement their obligations under the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. If you look at the requirement in Article 1 of the Charter, that states put in place legislative and other measures to give effect to the Charter or to Charter rights. And so, RECs then mediate. Of course, it is each individual state which implements. But when you have then collectives of states, then it becomes a given that regional economic committees should also be concerned about how this implementation happens. And finally, I think I just wish to highlight this truism. There's this truism now that human rights are in fact interdependent and interconnected with economic development, which was a primary reason for being of RECs. Now, human rights and economic development are in a symbiotic relationship. And so the arising question then is, and this is what this project is looking at, are the normative and institutional arrangements of the East African community up to the task of facilitating the promotion and protection of human and people's rights. Now, quickly in terms then of the problem, and I think some of the speakers in the opening session have already alluded to this, the promotion and protection of human and people's rights, as outlined in the African Charter, is one of the EAC's fundamental principles. So I think there's no doubt about that. When you look at the treaty, regardless of whether it makes it does indeed make explicit statements around human rights with its reference to human and people's rights. And so what you have then are various organs of the community playing different roles. Because the executive, which is a summit, the legislative assembly, also the South African Court of Justice, playing particular roles in this regard. Now, I think the concerns which we have are that the political will, the capacity to ensure human and people's rights, there are great doubts which remain. So it could be about political willingness of the summit and others, but also it could be about absence or limited capacities. So that, for example, when you look at the East African Community Summit, which has not sanctioned the protocol that would provide the ESCJ with explicit jurisdiction on human and people's rights. Or when you look at member states who actually, you might say, now are exercising backlash on the court's broad interpretation of the treaty. When you look at the failure by member states to enforce the judicial decisions which are made by regional and even continental organs. And obviously, people have already mentioned the extremely difficult context within which Kenyans, Ugandans, Tanzanians and the rest of East Africans are enjoying or not enjoying their civil liberties. This then, I would say, is a context within which this project is asking the question or is looking at the extent to which enforcement mechanisms have requisite levels of functionality and independence to provide redress to victims of human rights violations. And in this regard, then in the next few months, what will happen is that under 4 themes, we are asking writers to review the literature and make proposals, make recommendations around 4 themes. So quickly, just to mention the themes. Theme 1, locating human and people's rights within the East African integration agenda. So we want to look at the opportunities, the challenges, and the status of normative and institutional arrangements. Theme 2, litigating human and people's rights at the East African community. Again, we then want to see the sort of jurisprudence and also experience of litigants at the East African community level. So then again, we can try to figure what has been happening, good practice, and what else we need to be doing in this regard. Then we have a theme 3 on the East African community member states and as a focus or in relation to litigation within the African human rights system. As you know, here we are speaking about institutions like the African Court on Human People's Rights, the African Commission on Human People's Rights, and there are experiences in this regard which we have seen recently. For example, where some of our East African countries have on occasion declined not to implement decisions which are made by these other organs. So then the question becomes, so what? So what are the issues there? Finally, we'll be looking at comparative lessons and best practices. Actually, I think about this in terms of good practices rather than best practices of other RECs in the area of promotion and protection of human rights. So human and people's rights, ECOWAS, SADC, and there are so many others. So again, what can we learn from those in order to enrich the East African normative and practical experience in terms of their integration agenda vis-a-vis human and people's rights? So let me stop here, and then I said I had many roles. So now I shall turn myself into session chair for session 1. And in that regard, I should begin by saying that I noticed that I managed to speak in exactly 10 minutes, which was my allotted time. So I also hope I'm setting up a good precedent so that as we proceed, facilitators and presenters will keep a time in mind. So just one moment. So session 1, this first session, we have titled it Human and People's Rights as an Essential Pillar of Regional Integration. So, and remember I said we are working with 4 themes. We have 3 substantive sessions, which mean that 2 themes will be covered under one session, and we'll explain that later as we proceed. So this first session is titled Human and People's Rights as an Essential Pillar of Regional Integration. Now, the first thing we shall do is we shall have a keynote address which is titled Ensuring Human and People's Rights Within Africa's Prosperity. Ensuring Human and People's Rights Within Africa's Prosperity and Integration Agenda, Eschewing Challenges and Leveraging Successes. And our speaker is Mr. Brian Kagoro. Brian works with the Open Society Foundations. I think he's Director of Justice and Intersectionality. So I think he should be telling me I should not be thinking, I should be knowing. So Brian, I have met you virtually many times. We need to meet properly in person, but it's a pleasure to have you on this convening, sir. Brian is a strong advocate of Pan-Africanism, and when you listen to Brian, you really begin to appreciate the how being forward-looking looks like, from African perspective. So, Brian, I see the program says you have 16 minutes, so you're welcome, sir. Speak to us.
Lawrence, we've met, but you may be making a remark, because from the last time we met, I was smaller. I have since expanded as the problems of Africa have expanded. Let me express my most sincere gratitude to KHRC, the leadership, Annette, and also my friends who are members of the network. Let me also express my most sincere gratitude to you, Chair, and my elder and a mentor by far, Zain Abubakar. I think when Zain started us off, he spoke about the architecture and made reference to authoritarianism and its rise. And Lawrence, in your remarks, you went into depth describing the regional architecture and the question of political will and the absence and limited capacities within our states to implement agreed normative frameworks. Let me build on that. If I were to recapture the title that I agreed to speak to, I would simply, so that it sounds, in the words of Samora Machel, sufficiently political, but practical enough. I would simply say the struggle continues. How to build the ecosystem, value base, and mindset of human-centered Pan-Africanism using the human rights framework. Noam Chomsky, in his book entitled The Precipice, Neoliberalism, the Pandemic and the Urgent Need for Radical Change, suggests the following. He suggests that authoritarianism and populism are on the rise, and he gives examples of Hungary's Viktor Orban, Erdogan in Turkey, Bolsonaro, and Donald Trump in the US. But he says in this rising authoritarianism, he sees extremities, mostly to the right, but also to the left, that share certain common traits of behavior. Number one, they engage in repressive measures. Number two, they undermine all forms of collective decision-making and the democratization process itself. But number three, they are neo-fascist and xenophobic. So they employ neo-fascist and xenophobic rhetoric, and sometimes outright racist, sexist, tribalist, and religious intolerance, or some form of otherization of sections of the population. But number four, they gain popular support by an ideology of extreme nationalism. So he suggests that the authoritarian populist rise is in part due to the following: that it's in part due to the concerns about globalization, about immigration, and the fears of dilution of the national identity, especially amongst the peasantry, the lower and working classes. But number two, liberal democracies, or democracy itself, is still considered the best form of government, but it has not fared well at all when it comes to questions of diversity management, economic distribution and redistribution, welfare, well-being, human security, and livelihoods. In fact, it has not done that well when it comes to gender equality and the generational equity question. So if for young people and women, liberal democracy has given them the right to vote, but not necessarily the right to self-represent. That's why even in this beautiful Kenya, which is considered a democracy for a long time, the levels of representation of women and the regularity with which this occurs almost naturally as part of the national psyche remains questionable. But what also has happened is that extractivism, this idea that corporates, big corporates, in collusion with state elites, will extract minerals, will extract water, will cut forests, and do so with a level of impunity under the guise of development. The sexual and gender-based violence that's come. So if you take South Africa and Kenya as some of the most democratic countries on the continent, and you take levels of inequality, of poverty, levels of sexual and gender-based violence, levels of unemployment, if you take tendencies towards land grabs, and in some instances, state-sanctioned or state-sponsored or state-ignored violence, or just the poor public service by the state, or you take corruption, the COVID-gate scandals that the two leading democracies on the continent, or even if you added Ghana to that. So social, political, economic, religious fanaticism has been another mark of this rise of authoritarianism. These are entities who, under the guise of faith, are willing to subvert institutions and the democratic process in order to get what they want, or one of their own elected, or somebody who espouses the xenophobic values that they ascribe to. So our nations, and in particular here in East Africa, are deeply divided and highly polarized. So beyond the traditional ideological and political differences, but we've seen in the context of COVID that we seem to live in alternate conceptions of reality itself. So during COVID-19, or during this pandemic, we have witnessed the rejection of science, the embrace of conspiracy theories, amongst other things. But we have also seen that authoritarian populism survives through misinformation, disinformation, or structural lies, or fear-mongering, the idea that if this happens, you are going to have this dastardly outcome. But what has happened is that this rise of authoritarian populism is occurring where social bases of resistance are grossly eroded. And I'm talking here about the poor, the middle class, and others, but big business and elites, thieves in the state and outside the state, are basically better organized. But the internal threats that we face in the human rights movement, we are an aging movement. The average age of the leadership of the human rights movement in East Africa is 40. I am being generous, otherwise I would have said 50. Although there are many young people who are entering the movement, very few are at leadership levels. Yet the young people are on the cutting edge and leading in terms of technological innovations. They are leading within the corporate sector and elsewhere. It's also gendered, but we don't have sufficient diversity, whether it's minorities or ethno-diversity, or talking about religious representation. So we have a civil society that reproduces the hegemonies in our society, whether they're ethnic, religious, or class. And as such, when this civil society talks about rights, it has a tendency, obviously, to reflect to those issues that pertain to its class biases. But we are fragmented. As a result of histories of donor funding that set priorities of what they will fund, we soon grew into silos. Rights of the child, rights of elderly people, rights of this specialization, which was deemed necessary for accounting for results, has itself turned into an albatross around our necks in our ability to contest the rising authoritarian populism. But frankly, colleagues, some are merely model missionaries. There are those folks who are in this for a job. So between those who are here because it's a vocation to fight for justice and rights, and those who are in this because it's a job, we have a clash of paradigms. But look, our external threats are much bigger. We face states that Zain Abubakar rightly described as captured, whether these are states that have been wholly repurposed or institutions that have been repurposed to serve the interest of elites, of kleptocrats, or that have been subverted through fear or through politicization, such that you have the judicialization of politics, as somebody in Uganda said, and the politicization of the judiciary. And if you marry this capture of state with grand corruption, which has international networks, which is ethno-regional, and you marry it to the militarization and of institutions and of policing generally, that has resulted in many of our countries of either militaries playing roles in policing or the police using military tactics in order to deal with dissent, especially in the informal settlements in slums, against the poor, against those who are unhappy. So we see this militarism in society where the belief amongst young people is you must fight fire with fire. And the response by the state through use of colonial sedition laws, NGO regulation laws, or targeting or restrictions on funding, this enables impunity to thrive. But colleagues, we also face a threat from digitalization. So whilst our sector is made up of very smart people, it is the least digitalized sector. And I'm talking here about the legal profession and civil society. There is talk of e-justice, of e-governance, but when you juxtapose this against the real economy and real poverty and questions of equity and access to digital platforms, you will realize why the advances in biotech, in fintech, and the capacity of the state to do surveillance using technology and its ability to muzzle protests and literally undermine privacy has increased more significantly. And as a counter, we have not built the sophistry or the sophistication to counter this. In East Africa, we face a hostile nature or the environment. The floods, droughts, and also the vagaries of climate change. If you superimpose this on what I've talked about and the inequality, the dimensions of rights violations, both in the present and in the future, and also the historical, are fundamental. But the greatest threats to Africa remains by far, not just the kleptocratic authoritarian populists, but it is neoliberalism. The idea that you can develop economies that benefit a few, and by some reason, by applying restrictive laws, banning protests, restricting freedoms of association, of assembly and expression, you will achieve heaven, or you will achieve Agenda 2063 within the national confines, can only speak to a class blindness. We as lawyers are accomplices to this class blindness. The over-lawyerification and lawyerism that we attain or that we are portioned to our struggles essentially means we will win victories within the East African court. We have won victories within the ECOWAS court. We can win victories within national judicial platforms. But as Shivji points out, Issa Shivji points out that essentially most rights are guaranteed when they are the outcome of social struggle. Many who would otherwise struggle have either assigned that role of struggle to what lawyers can do in the courts and what judgments will be given. Colleagues, apart from neoliberalism, we must look at its most potent enabler, the new imperialism, not just from former colonial powers and traditional imperial forces, but our new friends from the East. The violation of rights of East Africans who go as domestic workers in the Middle East, the transnational racist nature of violation of rights of lower classes who within the confines of our borders are not finding life and livelihood, but who sacrifice life and limb trying to go and earn a living for their families, whether it's in the Middle East or in Europe, is an urgent matter for attention because it speaks to Afro-Arab solidarity, but it speaks to the Look East policy as a central piece of any East African human rights struggle. But when you are faced with national repression and oppression, sometimes these things pale in your psyche. Colleagues, we cannot do this struggle if we don't attend to the following disconnects that we suffer as a class, that we suffer as a sector. Number one, our connectedness to the working class and the poor and the peasantry. Number two, our ability to critique neoliberalism and imperialism at the same time that we critique our kleptocratic authoritarian state. The rise of populism that Zain Abubakar talked about must lead us to ask, who is most affected by it, why, where, and how, and what can we do about it? Does Agenda 2063 answer this? Does this rise of authoritarian populism, which is people who are actually elected dictators, is this going to erode our concepts of democracy? Number three, the question of patriotism from above, or this link between fascism, nationalism, and autocracy that we are seeing, this jingoism, extreme nationalism, this isolationism, where communities build barriers against each other, and the ability to form solidarities across classes is diminished. I want to suggest that the constitutional foundations of patriotism are based on national values and principles. The regional foundations of patriotism or Pan-Africanism are based on the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. We cannot defend the Charter purely as an instrument. We cannot defend liberty purely through institutions whose constitution is determined solely and exclusively by heads of state. I want to suggest that the solutions lie first in our mindset shifts. If we're to build an ecosystem of transformation, we must see the three axes of our challenges. The local axis, which is our connectedness to those communities most affected by rights, not purely in how we represent them in the courts, but how we join them in solidarity, as some members of this platform have done. Those who are in the slums, those who are in the villages, those who are outside the glare of cameras, those who are being evicted by mining companies in Uganda, in Kenya, in Tanzania, those whose labor is being forcibly expropriated, who are being forced into semi-slavery conditions, forming an alliance and a league of the excluded, the oppressed, those who are undermined because their identities are not deemed acceptable, whether that identity is their chosen way of life, or their identity is based on disability, or their identity is based on age. Whatever distinction or basis of discrimination, we need to form a league that goes beyond donor-funded silos. But education and conscientization. Gone are the days where we talk about rights as purely a common good. Rights have become an existential issue within the African Union. In a union that will ignore the plight of Palestinians in its pursuit of a right relationship with Israel, in a union that will more debate external matters than the question of access to energy, of water, of sanitation, of its own people. We need to enlarge the conceptions of Africa. We need to deal with the xenophobia that's crept in amongst the poor because it is constructed by the elite. The elite who are in business and politics are able to move freely. They are able to steal. In fact, they've become Pan-African thieves. But poor people are told somehow resent the foreigner, resent the outsider, such that those who are Kikuyu will see those who are Luo as outsiders, and those who are Taita will see Mijikenda as outsiders. Those who are Kenyans will see Ugandans as outsiders. Yet oppression and oppressors learn best practices of how to behave badly from each other. I want to end by saying, we face a fundamental question. And that fundamental question is how we look into the future and how we look into the past and how we engage the present. Polarization and democracy have become key issues. Executive takeovers have increased. Military coups are increasing across West Africa, the Sahel, and once the disease starts, it creeps across the entire continent. Deliberalization of regimes, deterioration of state authority due to political instability, escalation of civil conflict and insecurity, undermining of the rights of minorities, and the invocation of colonial laws and sectarian ideologies require that we do much more than legal education. It requires that we address the question of the class consciousness of judges, class consciousness of lawyers, but also we invest more, not just in human rights, but in defending such rights as the right to protest. We invest more in countering the use of executive powers. We invest more in countering the use of sedition laws to silence dissent. But it also requires that we invest in onboarding young people into these struggles. I thank you. I hope I've been able to say to you, the challenges we face are external, global. They are regional, they are national, local. But we also have internal contradictions. Our own consciousness of who we are as a special class, our own consciousness of how we have unproblematically embraced neoliberalism, which reproduces poverty and inequality, and somehow hope just by litigation will produce equality because it's written in constitution, is a contradiction in terms. Until we politicize how we do the law and how we do justice, we will continue to tinker on the margins of a system of economy that generates impunity of an economic, of a social and political nature. There are solutions. We are the solutions. Our mindset change is the solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. I think you've set the tone for us for this convening. Clearly, one cannot even attempt to abbreviate what you have said. I think the point that brings us here, whose focus is on expanding the enjoyment of human and people's rights within East Africa and the East African community. I think one of the key messages from Mr. Kagoro's address is that we should not really simply be defending the Charter purely as an instrument. It's far deeper than that. And I think he has highlighted the pushbacks from the international, the regional, the local levels, which we should keep in mind. Now, I am taking the decision that what Brian did was a keynote address, and before opening this up, I want to do the first presentation, and then now we can have a plenary, which may take account, must take account of what Mr. Kagoro has said, but also what the first presentation will also be focused on, because I want to try to catch up on time, the time which we lost at the beginning. Now, in that regard, I want to introduce Dr. Victor Lando, and Dr. Victor Lando is one of the writers for this project of the Kenya Human Rights Commission. I need to stress that at this point, what Dr. Lando and the other writers will be speaking to us about are their initial thoughts on the various issues, themes, which we have outlined. And what we are expecting from the various plenaries which will happen in the course of this morning is to help us with the thinking process of then how we can begin answering some or many of the questions which then will eventually be part of the recommendations that come out of the project. So to introduce Dr. Lando, Victor Lando, presently he's a senior lecturer at Riara Law School in Nairobi, and he also works at a law firm where he's managing partner with a number of his colleagues. Dr. Lando has a law degree from the University of Nairobi, and also master's and doctoral degrees from the Center for Human Rights in Pretoria. Dr. Lando has worked in a number of key institutions, including the International Rescue Committee, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and also the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, where actually I worked with him. And also he has published in the fields of human rights, regional integration, and constitutional law. Now, so what Dr. Lando is doing for us this morning, so Dr. Lando's presentation focuses on locating human and people's rights within the East African community integration agenda. And he's looking or thinking through questions of opportunities, challenges, and status of normative and institutional arrangements. Some of the issues which we were thinking might be relevant for the discussion that happens here are: one, what aspects of the East African Community Treaty advance human and people's rights as part of the integration agenda? So again, what we're asking there is what aspects inhibit that? And then question number two, are the institutional arrangements of the East African community well placed to further the promotion and protection of human rights, and what can be improved? The final question, what role can the public and civil society play in shaping the East African community's framework on human and people's rights? Are the organs of the community sufficiently open to public participation, and what can be improved? So Dr. Lando, you're welcome to speak to us, sir, and you have 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Lawrence, for that introduction. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thank you as well to KHRC for convening us today to discuss, matters pertaining to regional integration and how to, ensure human rights promotion and protection is strengthened within the East African community. Now, I got to get an interest in the EAC when I was working at the National Commission on Human Rights, actually, so it sparked my interest on matters of regional integration and on matters of EAC. And it inspired me to go into a whole tangent on issues that pertain to the functioning and human rights within the East African community. So to start with, I'll make my presentation in four parts. The first part will look at regional integration communities and human rights, the human rights in RECs or RECs. The second bit will look at the EAC's human rights framework. And then the third bit will look at the organs and institutions of the EAC. And then lastly, I'll look at the role of civil society within the EAC framework and the opportunities and challenges. All right. So first off, when you look at RECs, I call them RECs, RECs and human rights, regional economic communities, the ones that were fashioned post-independence, the very early ones, were set up primarily for the achievement of economic development. There were no express references to human rights. And governance, democracy, rule of law, and all those things were not part of the agenda then, at least expressly and explicitly within the founding treaties. And when you look, for example, at Article 2 of the 1967 Treaty for East African Cooperation, you find that the main objective was to strengthen industrial, commercial, and other relations for the achievement of economic development. Okay, and even when you look at the OAU charter establishing the Organization of African Unity, there were no express provisions pertaining to human rights as such. Mainly, it was on matters of reaffirming and reasserting independence reasserting territorial integrity for this new emergent independent states. However, we noticed that as time moved on and with the consolidation of democracy, then the existing RECs and even new ones that were formed then repurposed themselves to look at development through a human rights lens. And so they have refined their focus to pursue development through a human rights lens, at least within their overall treaty frameworks, okay? So for example, they have either included human rights as the fundamental objectives, guiding principles, etc. And they have also referred to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights as the normative standard. So they want to do development in accordance with the principles and the goals set out in the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. So for example, when you look at the revised ECOWAS Treaty, when you look at the SADC Treaty, the SADC Treaty, look at the COMESA Treaty, and even look at the East African, the treaty establishing the EAC of 1999, it has then created room for the promotion and protection of human rights within the normative framework of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. So you find that there is a recognition of the symbiotic relationship between good governance, human rights, rule of law, and regional integration. You know, that the respect for human rights is a key ingredient for successful integration. And that successful integration also provides opportunities for enhanced protection of human rights among converging states. So the argument is that there is a symbiotic relationship between regional integration and the promotion and protection of human rights. Now, to what extent has this symbiotic relationship been given effect to within the EAC treaty framework, right? When you look at a couple of provisions within the EAC treaty that have that provide a grounding for the promotion and protection of human rights. And I'll go through three of them, but you can find quite a number of them also just scattered all through the treaty. There are provisions that speak to, for example, peace and security, and you can then extrapolate and say that we can look at peace and security through a human rights lens. But the explicit human rights provisions are, of course, Article 6D and 7.2 of the EAC treaty, where the partner states have agreed to a set of fundamental and operational principles, which include good governance, democracy, rule of law, gender equality, and the promotion and protection of human rights, in accordance with the provisions of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. Apologies, I'm using my phone, so the video will be a bit weird at some point. And when you look at the provisions in the EAC treaty that provide that one of the objectives is the promotion and protection of human rights, using the AAC treaty, using the African Charter as a normative standard, you find that this is a stock phrase. I call it a stock phrase. When you look at Article 3G of the Treaty for the African Economic Community, you find that that phrase has been replicated. When you look at the EAC treaty, you look at the COMESA treaty, you look at the SADC treaty, look at the revised ECOWAS treaty, you find that that is a stock phrase that is seen across all those treaties that establish those regional economic communities, you know, where they seek to promote and protect human rights, and the normative framework, the normative standard is the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. Now, in addition to Article 6D and 7.2 of the EAC treaty, there's Article 7, of course, 7.1a of the EAC treaty that talks about a people-centered and market-driven cooperation. And this is basically people-centeredness, and people-centeredness then would mean that you consult the people. There's a lot of public participation. There's democratization of regional integration. What Zain was referring to earlier about the constitution of the IALA, for instance, that there is need for direct election of IALA members, for instance. Article 7.1a of the treaty talks about people-centeredness and market-driven cooperation. And when you look at the case of the East African Law Society versus the AG of the Republic of Kenya and 3 others, where basically the executives within the East African community decided to amend the EAC treaty. And the East African Law Society went to the EACJ, and they said that, look, you needed to have consulted with the East African citizens. That public participation is one of the key principles in the treaty, and the Court of Justice agreed with them and said that yes, public participation, involvement of the citizens of the East African community is a key provision of the treaty, and you can't really just amend the treaty like that. You must involve the citizens and the people of the EAC. And so that goes beyond even treaty amendment. It goes all through the questions of governance, go through the questions of how do then people engage within the EAC treaty framework. And that sets the stage again for involvement of civil society, involvement of the citizens and people of the EAC within the workings of the East African community. Then secondly, there's the case of the famous Mohochi case, Samuel Mohochi versus the Attorney General of Uganda, where the East African Court of Justice also observed that the principles, the Article 6D and Article 7.2 of the EAC treaty that refer to human rights, that these are foundational, they are core, they are indispensable to the success of the integration agenda. That they are to be observed as a matter of treaty obligation, and that they must be adhered to by the partner states. And therefore, the recognition of the promotion and protection of human rights are foundational, they are core, they are indispensable. And so that provides a very solid foundation for human rights. And lastly, as I proceed, in the Plaxida Rugumba case, again, versus the Secretary General of the EAC and the Attorney General of Rwanda, the EAC again said that the inclusion of human rights principles in the EAC treaty was not meant to be a cosmetic exercise, that it was a serious commitment to the promotion and protection of human rights in line with the treaty imperatives. And so there is a very strong treaty foundation, basically, for the promotion and protection of human rights within the EAC treaty framework. And of course, the reference to the African Charter, again, gives us a normative framework for human rights within the East African community. Now, of course, that does not mean that the EAC treaty is a human rights treaty, like the African Charter or like the ICCPR, etc. No, it is a treaty, a constitutive treaty of the EAC. However, it has provisions that provide a grounding for the promotion and protection of human rights. So that is basically the institutional framework of the East African, not the institutional, but the human rights framework, the treaty basis for human rights within the EAC treaty. Now, of course, with regard to the organizations and institutions, Zain had already spoken to that earlier. And when you look at the summit of the heads of states, of course, this is a summit of the national executives. And now there are questions whether are they committed to human rights? Because, human rights is mostly a pushback against excesses or against certain actions by executives. So yes, the summits, depending on the prevailing scenarios, they may make a move towards the promotion of rights. Sometimes they do, sometimes they try to shield each other. When you look at the Council of Ministers, of course, they are also a clear extension of national executives, and you know how that works. However, again, the Council of Ministers are very important in terms of policy formulation and rollout of policy. So, for example, we have in place an East African Community gender policy, and the Council was very instrumental in debating it and rolling it out. And so the council provides an opportunity for civil society and for scholars and for other stakeholders to plug in to their functions in order to further the cause of human rights. So policy framework, policy formulation, the council is a clear actor there. Now we have IALA, of course. IALA has the legislative, the representative, and the oversight mandate. And of course, now as the legislative body, as the representative body, and if you go to direct elections, then it would have a stronger impact in terms of putting the executive in check, just the way they do in the national scenario. However, again, the effectiveness of the IALA, are they extensions of national executives? When you look at how members of the IALA are elected, they're not directly elected. There's a lot of influence of the national executives, especially if there's the winning party that forms government, then they'll have a very strong, influence on who goes to IALA. So again, that is a question that needs to be looked at, and we'll be looking at that in our article. And so, but there's the power of petition. The power of petition, for example, in the Burundi case, IALA was able to receive a petition and deal with that petition. So the power of petition is a powerful tool that civil society can hang on to, can latch onto, and use it to push some of those human rights issues that bedevil the partner states and that bedevil human rights within the sub-region. Of course, the East African Court of Justice has been the most prolific in terms of most active when it comes to human rights, because yes, it does not have a clear mandate on human rights, but it has, through creative interpretation, said that yes, we will interpret the treaty, and so we interpret provisions that have reference to human rights. We will not shy away. We look at the Katabazi case and the outcome of the Katabazi case, which laid the foundation for human rights litigation before the ESCJ. And so again, it has been very active on human rights. So that is a strong institution that, an institution that has come out very strongly with regards to safeguarding human rights. However, when you look at what Solomon Ebobra says, that the jurisdiction of the ESCJ, it's mostly declaratory. The ESCJ has not issued very robust, very strong, very hard-hitting decisions. And probably because of the outcome of the Anyang' Nyong'o case, the ramifications and the backlash against the ESCJ when they came to that decision. So they have to do a very neat balancing between not judicial activism, but being independent and steering away from the backlash from the national executives and the regional executives, especially in the light of the Anyang' Nyong'o case and what happened there. Now, the Secretariat has an investigative mandate, which it needs to deploy, and it has not really been deployed very well, but it has that mandate under the treaty. It could.
Do try to sum up.
Yes. I'll be done in 2 minutes. Yes. Now, in terms of what role for civil society, of course, when you look at the preamble to the treaty, there is a provision there that requires that gives space and room for civil society, and says that the role of the civil society is critical. Then, of course, Chapter 25 of the EAC Treaty devotes an entire chapter to participation of the private sector and civil society. The private sector have taken advantage of this, but we need, again, the civil society to also be organized across the partner states to take advantage of this. We know, of course, that IALA, that PALU, Kituo cha Katiba, NHRIs, and even KHRC are working around the clock on issues of human rights across the partner states, but they still need to have more hands on deck. So how do we take advantage of this? Relationship building, confidence building, soft law. Soft law is a good area that the EAC civil society can take advantage of. So for example, the gender policy, the human rights policy, elections, policy on elections, policy on human rights defenders across the region, what the president of the East African Law Society spoke about earlier, the bill on protecting human rights across the East African partner states, etc. So soft law is a good place to start. Latch onto the treaty provisions on civil society and relationship building, and having friends across the East African community partner states and creating strong networks. So those are the opportunities that we'll be exploring. And I think I've overshot my time frame, but thank you very much. I think we'll deal more once our writings are complete and the articles are complete, and we'll be able to give a more in-depth discussion. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Lando. So what we're going to do now is let's engage Dr. Lando, and also I hope Mr. Kagoro is still here, so we will also engage him. Now, if you wish to speak, you may raise your hand, and then we'll pick you, we'll ask you to speak. You can also use the chat box to raise questions. So please do raise your hands. And who is helping me to look at that? Is that you, Martin? Someone? Martin, I think?
Yes, Commissioner. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, Commissioner.
So please tell me, I want at least three people to raise their issue. So has anyone raised their hand yet?
Yes, we have a hand raised from the President of the Law Society, East African Law Society, Mr. Bernard Lando.
Okay, Mr. President, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the discussants for the well-presented papers. I think it's an opportunity for us to discuss the role of the East African Civil Society Organization, and I think I've seen the ED on the call. In my view, it's one of the ways in which we can come together. We need to strengthen that association, that society. We need to strengthen it. We need to work together under that society, because even at the regional level, the African peer review mechanism has just formed a non-state actors coalition. And that non-state actors coalition is going to be looking at the regional sort of organizations which have come up, because the easy way to try and get the people participating at state level and at national level. So I would just want to hear the thoughts of the two discussants on how we can actually strengthen the East African Civil Society Organization. It is high time we work together, and it is high time we have a borderless institution that can actually speak when rights are being violated. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have someone else?
No, Commissioner, we don't have.
Sorry, just to assist you, Martin, I see in the chat box Dr. Livingston Sevanyana has said he would like to make a contribution.
Thank you, Andrew. Bernard, please give Dr. Livingston Sevanyana access. Dr. Livingston, the floor is yours.
Hello, do you hear me all?
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear.
Great. I'm Dr. Livingston Sevanyana from Uganda. I'm the Executive Director of the Foundation for Human Rights Initiative, as well as the current United Nations Independent Expert on promoting a democratic and equitable international order. I must say thank you to Kenya Human Rights Commission for having invited me to participate in this important forum. I have enjoyed the discussions. They are largely spot on, but as someone who actually follows and whose mandate is actually to see at a global level the current democratic discourse. I have noted with definitely a lot of concern, like most speakers have said, the growing democratic backlash in this region. In terms of strengthening the East African community, in my view, to promote respect for human rights, we need to go back to the drawing board and ask ourselves, what was the raison d'etat for the establishment of the East African community? Was the establishment based on the necessity to maintain peace, stability, respect for human rights, and promote development? Is there still such a commitment to that? Have the organs that have been established worked towards realization of that goal? Are the citizens really enjoying their freedom? And certainly you'll find that many of the organs that have been established are largely ineffective, they are weak. And where's the missing link? Largely, I think it was rightly put by one of the speakers, there is lack of political will. There seems to be a lot of push for self-preservation. The institutions that were established in the region are all getting weaker and weaker, whether in terms of the appointment process, whether in terms of financing. And when we look at elections, we hardly see any fair, inclusive election in any of these countries. Most of the elections are characterized by, of course, brutality and unfairness, voter bribery, rigging, and the like. So the question then, is it possible for the East African community actually to be strengthened? I think we need to broaden the spaces. We need to reach out to the political elite. Whether you are talking about the East African Court of Justice, whether you talk about IALA, whether you talk about all these organs, the summit, I think we need to go back to the drawing board and ask the leaders, are they still committed to the goals for which the East African community was established? If they say yes, then they need to take deliberate steps to strengthen these institutions through the appointment process and also financing, and giving them the leeway to do the job that they're supposed to do. Otherwise, we see a deadly silence on the part of the community when rights are violated, when processes are flouted, and really inequality is growing by the day in each of these member states. So I welcome this project and the discussion, but I think we really need to get back to the drawing board, because there is a lot of suffering, there's a lot of oppression, there's a lot of inequality, and many people are asking whether this community, the East African community and its organs, are really serving them, or do they live to the very goals for which they were established? Thank you, Lawrence and colleagues. I look forward to hearing more and enjoying the discussion. Thank you from me here in Kampala.
Thank you, Dr. Livingston Sevanyana. Commissioner Mutu, we have 3 more hands up. We have Janet Jebichi. Bernard, could you please give Janet Jebichi access? Janet,
but I should ask people, please be extremely brief, because we are behind time. So we'll take those 3 comments and then we'll stop there. So please be very brief, please.
Okay, thank you for the guidance, Commissioner. Janet Jebichi, the floor is yours. Turn on your mic, please.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My contribution, or my question is, what is the role of civil society within the EAC framework, or what is the probable role that the civil society can play in order to ensure that the jurisdiction of the East African Court of Justice is expanded to include the human rights jurisdiction? Because as we understand the state as it is right now, the ESCJ strictly or legally doesn't have jurisdiction over human rights violations. And actually it has been, the court has actually been playing an activism role in ensuring that any act or omission that amounts to human rights violation is interpreted to mean that the particular state has infringed the fundamental and operational principle of the EAC. So my question is there a possibility that the civil society can do something to ensure that the Council of Ministers fast-track the conclusion of the protocol to expand the jurisdiction of the EACJ? Thank you.
Thanks, Jebichi. The next hand we have up is Jacqueline Mutere.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I don't know whether mine is a question or it's more of a ventilation. And I'm just interested to know about how we would actually know that any of these institutions and all these bodies and all these organs of the EAC are actually valuable to communities within its mandate. Because I see that let me just backtrack a little bit. I'm a survivor of sexual violence, and I've not seen any input whatsoever, either through the gender policy or either through the transitional justice process, that they have actually involved themselves in any way with Kenya. So I'm also trying to wonder, is it us to reach out to them, or is it them to hold states accountable? Is it them to investigate? And I think I had a presenter discuss and talk about the investigative role of one of their bodies. And I'm wondering how much trauma or human rights violation qualifies for your interventions. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. The next hand up was Sarah Birete. Sarah,
yeah,
go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, our dear presenters and panelists. Good morning from Uganda. And I have about 3 comments to make. I joined in halfway Kagoro's presentation, and I was, if I repeat some things, please forgive me. I was thinking about the principle of the East African Treaty, which should be people-centered and private sector-led. The private sector section has moved, but when it comes to people-centeredness, I think we are being participated as citizens of East Africa. There's little to do with people, and that's what gets the debate on human rights lost in all their engagements. It's state by state, private sector have found their way, but as civil society and general citizens, I think we are still outside the major activities of the community. The other, and I don't know what we can do to have, I know the civil society, East African Civil Society Forum. I am a member in Uganda, I've participated in some regional activities, and there are proposals to amend the treaty to have a more recognized participation of civil society. And whether that happens or not, I don't even know how many organizations in the room have attained observer status to monitor the engagements of the community. So long as we stay outside the major engagements of the community, how shall we influence and make the community work for the common man and be people-centered to address concerns of human rights as well as other concerns when we are not part of the main players in the work? There is also the other element where we should call out the treaty. And for me, the test for the East African community was unfolding in the following key examples. One is how we managed the invasion of locusts as the community. There was no harmonization. Every country was doing their own issues as if the community is not relevant at that level. The same applies to COVID. Even comparing the hiccups at the borders, the different test and regulation regimes, the challenges we face as we travel through East Africa citizens. So also that, to me, demonstrated the disconnect and lack of harmony within the practices of the East African community. We also have trade wars that affect citizens involved in trade, and the lack of harmonization in different issues, including charging of work permits. For Uganda and Rwanda, we faced the 3-year closure of border, which affected the enjoyment of free movement of goods, services, and persons. And even as we talk now, there is partial opening of the border. The community is completely not engaged with the conflict between Uganda and Rwanda. Yet the other principle of the treaty is peaceful resolution of conflict. So is the treaty working? Is it relevant? Who does it serve? Then when you look at
thank you, madam. Thank you, madam.
If I just conclude one point, the failure for member states to call out each other on human rights violations. There are kidnaps going on in Uganda, there is torture, and all the other neighbors are quiet at state level. Thank you very much.
Let's have the last hand briefly, please.
Okay, Lilian Riziki, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Lilian Riziki. I'm from South Sudan, a former government official, as well as an activist, a founder of a nonprofit organization. I just listening to you, there are so many questions actually raised. There is an economist who once said that countries that catching up from behind has an increasing disadvantage in developing late. And when the East African Community was launched, countries were given time to prepare before they joined, like Tanzania and Uganda. And I think South Sudan was not necessarily prepared to join the community. Because of so many issues that you all know, the lack of sufficient institutions and the infrastructure and skilled labor force to carry out the objective of the East African community in general. But I have the one pressing question that I really wanted to raise, and I wanted to ask that what is the role of the Kenyan Human Rights Commission, or in general the East African community, in protecting members of the East African within their territories? Especially recently in the last years, we have seen the increased cases of abduction and deportation of the East African community members to their home to be executed. So if we're talking about human rights and protection and all these beautiful statements that we're making, but what is it that we're doing protecting members of the community within these individual countries? Having said that, I think, okay.
Thank you, madam. Now, let me give direction on how we should proceed. Clearly, you already noticed that the discussions and the questions which are arising are wide-ranging. Those questions and the comments obviously would not be resolved in just a single presentation or a couple of presentations. So the discussion will be ongoing, and actually, in fact, the challenge which then is being raised, the challenges which are being raised are then about that we should ensure this whole project takes account of all the issues, all the questions which are being raised. So what I'll ask Mr. Kagoro and Dr. Lando, perhaps to take 1 minute each, just to see, or perhaps to make a comment or remark on what they think is the issue they might want to pick up. And then now we shall conclude this panel and move to the next one. So please, Mr. Kagoro. Or Dr. Lando, if Mr. Kagoro is not present.
Okay, let me just take 1 minute to speak to a couple of issues that have been raised. One is on the jurisdiction of the East African Court of Justice. In the wake of the Kenyan, the issue of ICC and the president and deputy president before they took power in Kenya, before they were elected, at that time, there was a protocol that was supposed to extend jurisdiction to include human rights, but then a protocol was done, but it excluded human rights jurisdiction. That I think was in 2012 2014 or thereabout. And it was based on the argument that they have already acceded to the African Charter and that any human rights concern should be ventilated through the African Court. Then some states also mentioned that they have sufficient national constitutional safeguards to protect human rights. So I think that is an ongoing conversation. I think it may be revived so that the EACJ is vested with, again, human rights jurisdiction. Now, for the other issues that have been raised, I think EACs, like government, our very own national governments, they have very limited resources. They depend a lot on donor funding. And so sometimes they may not be everywhere. However, just like government, again, there's a treaty basis for CSO, civil society, to engage with the East African organs. And so I think the East African civil societies need to be organized, and they need to deliberately engage with the processes at the EAC, or even make proposals and say, we want to do 1, 2, 3. What do you think? We have a basis under the treaty to engage or to do 1, 2, 3 things. I think if relationship building, confidence building, and taking advantage of the treaty basis for CSOs to be involved, just like the Business Council has done. They know that it affects their bottom lines, and so they have taken the initiative to engage. And so CSOs also, we may need to deliberately organize and deliberately engage with the organs and the institutions of the EACJ. No, not of the EAC, including the EACJ, IALA, the Secretariat. There's a political officer Secretariat that engages quite a lot with the CSOs. And so that can also be an entry point. So yes, there are challenges. And I think this session provides an expose of what challenges we have. And I think we'll address this even as we continue with our writings. And maybe at the next convening, we'll have a couple of solutions that are more sustainable, because as Commissioner Muti has said, it can't be addressed all in this setting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kagoro?
Commissioner, Mr. Kagoro is not yet back, so... Okay,
so then Mr. Morris from the Secretariat, I think was supposed to speak earlier, is able to answer one of the questions which has been raised. So Mr. Morris, from the Secretariat, EAC, welcome, sir. Briefly.
Commissioner, apologies, but it's supposed to be Christine Mutimura, and she's actually online. Christine?
Actually, if I may, okay. Just to flag quickly, I can see Maurice Tabewa from the chat box saying he could respond to some of the issues.
Oh, okay, great. Bernard, please grant Maurice access. Maurice, you have the floor.
Yes, hello. Good afternoon. Good morning, everyone. I didn't notice it was already morning, and I thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to you today about our role at the East African Community Secretariat. I've been listening right from the beginning. I've listened to all the speakers, and I've been taking note. In fact, I couldn't say more than what has been presented, right from Honorable Zain's submission to Commissioner Lawrence and Dr. Lando, but also the wonderful keynote we received from David Kagoro. I can't say any more than that. Actually, if we were to make a presentation notes or remarks, that could have probably been the gist of whatever was discussed. So I'll just go to responses to the questions that have been raised. I will not talk much about the role of the court and of the organs in promoting human rights in the ESC. Maybe this will be an ongoing conversation, because it's a huge conversation. Once we look at the independence of the different organs and institutions, we also look at the roles they can play, the mandates they have, the treaty, the treaty mandates that are given to them and the operational reality of what they do vis-a-vis the mandate they have been given by the treaty. That will be a long discussion, and I think this is the aim of the project. We can have more discussions, but probably I can speak towards what we can do going forward as civil societies. I am not the principal political affairs officer. I'm actually a gender expert. I work in the Gender and Community Development Department. So I've had many references of the gender policy, but we have many human rights-based policies. And I think human rights has been at the center of policy development in the ESC. And part of that also involves citizen-led processes. So we consult so much with the civil society, and actually you may say that the private sector is very strong, but I feel the civil society also is very strong, only that it has been diminishing, that the strength of the civil society has been diminishing over time. Because in my experience in the ESC, there is no single policy that has been passed and has not been subjected to consultations with the civil society. There is no law or bill that has gone through the East African Legislative Assembly that has not gone through public hearings. So really the people-centered principle and the subsidiarity principles are implemented only to varying levels, and that's where maybe we need to strengthen our role as civil societies. We have what we call the consultative dialogue framework, and this is a framework
I'm sorry, I'm sorry, we are pressed for time, so please just take 1 more minute and then conclude, please. I'm sorry.
Okay, just 2 minutes. Is that okay?
Go on.
Yeah, so we have the consultative dialogue framework, which creates a space and a platform for continuous dialogue among the civil society organizations with the ESC organs and institutions. And the consultative dialogue submits or has an apex forum with the Secretary General, where key recommendations of issues that are regional are taken to the SG, and through the Secretary General, they are then transferred to the policy-making organs, especially the Council of Ministers, but sometimes ultimately to the summit. And we've had about 6 Secretary Generals Forum, and we are preparing for the 7th. So this is an open space, which maybe we can interrogate more and see how we can strengthen it through the various dialogue parties. So over to you, and I'm happy that you gave me this opportunity.
Thank you again, sir. I think let's conclude this panel here. The point here is that we'll continue the discussions in the next panel, and in particular, this is just setting the scene for the actual preparation of papers, which then I think will help. And so the discussions, the questions which are happening already will give us valuable guidance as we proceed with the writing. Martin, I just want to confirm that Mr. Ibrahima Kane is in the room, in the virtual room, because now we are handing it to Mr. Ibrahima Kane.
Yes, Commissioner. Mr. Ibrahima Kane is in the virtual room.
Yes, my brother Ibrahima is around. Good morning, Lawrence. Good morning, colleagues. I'm really, really happy to be associated to this conversation. I can say this intergenerational conversation on human rights in East Africa. I really want to thank the Kenya Human Rights Commission and its partners for really organizing this kind of activity at the moment where human rights is at its crossroad in Africa, not only at the continental level, at the regional level, but also at the national level. I don't want to be long on those issues, but you all understand what I'm saying here. And I'm also happy to really share this conversation on as a tool of enforcement of human rights, because many, and even the conversation that we just finished, believe that sometimes litigation is not a good tool because it's costly, because it takes a lot of time, and some even when you get success, it's quite hard to really get your decision implemented by the member states. It's true, all those things are right. But at the same time, the process within which litigation can take you is a very interesting process. And it'll help to educate, it'll help people to better understand how a system functions. But it's more importantly, it helps actors to have a dialogue about the issues that have been taken as a litigation problem before the court. So I think we all should view litigation not only as a tool to do to take cases to court, but we also need to look at it as a tool to do advocacy. We look at it as a way of also kicking off a dialogue with the state that is always the one that needs to account on its act or failure to protect human life and human dignity. Now, it is really interesting to talk about litigation before the East African Community Court of Justice, because the East African Community Court of Justice was not, initially designed to specifically deal with human rights. And, the treaty itself said that the human rights, there will be possibilities to use the body to deal with human rights issues. And yet, actors, particularly civil society organizations, have been really very courageous and well organized to be able to put the East African Community Court on task, and finally getting some very interesting interpretation of the East African Court on its jurisdiction on human rights issues. And that's why I think this conversation will be very, very interesting to see that a body that has even no mandate to deal with human rights, but uses other provision of its treaty to deal with the human rights aspect. That's why the conversation today will be really very interesting. And I think the conversation, as I see the people who will be talking very soon, will be very interesting because Africa offers today an opportunity to have a comparative analysis of the efficiency or the effectiveness of the East African community. We can compare it with the SADC Tribunal. We can compare it with the ECOWAS Court of Justice. But more close to that, we can compare it with the African Court on Human and People's Rights, which is even located in your region. So I think it's really good that we have two people who will be talking to these issues, and I think they will be able to lead us to questions that are of relevance of this region when it's come to human rights, when it's come to really making sure that the norms and principles that are enshrined in the East African Community normative framework are really implemented by this body. First, Selemani will take us in how to litigate human rights issues at the East African community, as I said, in a system that was not designed primarily to look at this thing. And I think, colleagues, it will be important to hear from somebody who has an experience on litigating not only at the local level, but also on litigating at the level of the East African Community Court to give us, all the nuances, all the problems that it's facing. And I think Selemani will also help us to see if really states are implementing the decision of the game. Because at the end of the day, what matters is the implementation of a decision taken by the court. And after that, we will have Horace, Dr. Horace, who works at the moment at the African Court on Human and People's Rights, to look at the East African Community Court within the framework of the African human rights system. The African human rights system came literally after the East African Community Court. Don't forget that the East African Community exists since 1967, the first regional community in Africa, and the first that put in place system that allowing this kind of protection. And it will be good for him to tell us, for example, I'm always curious to understand why, for example, Tanzanians prefer to go to the African Court on Human and People's Rights rather than to the East African Community Court when it's come to the violation of the human rights. So I think Horace will help us to understand that, but Horace will also help us to understand, if there are mechanisms that allow close collaboration, cross-fertilization between the African Court on Human and People's Rights and the East African community. So this is my introduction to the conversation, and I hope that we will have an opportunity to really go in depth with the issue of litigation as an effective and efficient tool to really save human dignity and human life. So, but Lawrence, I will ask you to really help in that regard, because I'm also in Nairobi at the Kenyan Human Rights Commission and helping groups that are trying to do litigation on nationality issues. So, but because I was asked to moderate this conversation, I accepted. But now I'm with that task to help these people, and they are all in the premises of the Kenyan Human Rights Commission. So what I will do, because you and I, we worked a lot within the African system to make it effective. So I can really ask you to continue to moderate this conversation as I'm going in and out. But please help me to do that. So Selemani, you have 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes to really take us to the conversation on litigating human rights in the East African community system, how it is done, and what are the key lessons we can learn from the experience that we have this recent year on action before this court by civil society organization, but also by state and the East African community as an organization. So you have 15 minutes, and I will ask Lawrence to continue the moderation. Thank you. Selemani, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ibrahima. And I'd just like to say thanks once again to the organizers for putting this together. I think this is it's a really important topic, as has been mentioned and as has been shown by the enthusiasm around many of the issues that we've discussed in some of the earlier sessions. I'll try and be very brief in the interest of time and essentially walk you through some sort of preliminary thoughts around, the project and how sort of my sort of intervention and paper will be structured. And essentially, the theme that I'm looking at is around, litigating human rights at the East African community with a particular focus on the East African Court of Justice. And essentially, I would like us to sort of reflect jointly on a series of questions. As Ibrahim has mentioned, the East African Court of Justice was never really established as a human rights court per se. It was primarily a trade court. And in 2022, February, we are sort of celebrating slightly over 21 years of its existence. And for many of the first years, I think the first 4 or 5 years, the court didn't have any case. It was only in the mid-2000s that it received its first case, and then subsequently thereafter, a group of entrepreneurial litigants began to approach the court increasingly with issues that related to governance and human rights. And this progressively expanded, the court's work to cover increasingly human rights issues, to the point that the EACJ was, quite actively known as one of the few places for redress around human rights issues. So essentially, I'll explore the question around what the court has been saying about human rights and how it's approached questions of human rights. I think Victor Lando spoke about some of the notable cases, the Katabazi case, which sort of consolidated the court's approach to human rights, which is in essence saying the treaty contains human rights provisions, and as a court, they will not shy away from interpreting those human rights provisions and reading into them broad provisions of human rights. So I'll explore that in part. However, as the court evolved increasingly, in the late 2000s, we saw tensions emerging around, the court's flexibility or the court's activist role, as some would say, around issues of human rights. And, we began to see some measures being taken by partner states to, in essence, curtail the role of the court. That included one, creating an appellate division, and then two, influencing increasingly the appointment of judges at the court. And so the second question that the paper will discuss is how the court has evolved over time with issues of human rights, and how it has responded in part to this issue of backsliding and greater authoritarian control by partner states and other actors around the court. How has its jurisprudence evolved? What has it been doing to address some of these issues? And what is the current state of play as it is? The third question, and I think a very important question, again, many people have been referring to this when speaking about the communities, is in essence a question of utility. So both with these opportunities and constraints, how valuable has the court been to litigants? What experiences can we draw from the experience of litigants with respect to the court, its jurisprudence? And to a certain extent, the fourth question will be issues around implementation. So with all the challenges that exist, the limitations around the court's human rights mandate, the pressures and perceptions about effectiveness, is this court valuable for litigants, and how have its decisions been implemented? And then towards the end, I will begin to look at sort of prospects and recommendations. Some of you will know that initially in the treaty, there was a provision in Article 30 that refers to the ability to expand the mandate of the court to include a broad number of areas. That has been done in part, but it has not been done to give the court an express human rights jurisdiction. What does that mean for the court? Is this a possibility? How can we, as people who are passionate about this issue, advocate and keep this issue fresh in the minds of many of the policymakers? But then also, what does the third decade of the court hold in store? If you look at many of the cases that the court that are visiting the court currently, I believe we are seeing a gradual trend away from sort of your traditional civil and political rights to include increasingly, I think the ELS president mentioned, issues related to economic rights, issues related to social rights. Trade is increasingly becoming a factor that is being litigated at the court. And how will the court adopt sort of a jurisprudential approach to its work going forward? And then based on those sort of broad issues that will be discussed in the paper, I will draw some final conclusions and recommendations, essentially around how the court can navigate its future, but also how as interested stakeholders we can support the court. Thank you very much, Ibrahima and moderators. I think I will stop there, but I welcome questions, reflections, and comments from the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Selamani. I'm assuming Ibrahima is not here. Now, as you said, Selamani, these are preliminary thoughts, and I think we need now to, give you some responses. Please, participants, let's try to focus on what the presenter has set out, and let's try to help him to think through the issues, and perhaps there may be other issues which he would also need to focus on. So this is our opportunity. So for example, if I might begin, it seems to me that the discussion on backlash is quite critical to what we do moving forward as East Africans in terms of ensuring human and people's rights. So the discussion on backlash, extremely important, which means also that we will need to nuance even the critiques which we make. So for example, I would hope, Selamani, that if you take a specific issue, such as the creation of an appellate court, it would be an interesting discussion, for example, to see whether in and of itself that was a good or a bad. Because usually the expectation would be that if an appellate court is being created, it's so that it can provide litigants. So litigants, whether states or individuals, claiming in this case human rights violations, more opportunities for redress. So I think it will be interesting to see that discussion happening a little more when you go out to research this area. Also, again, I think it has always, I think, been a given, or it seems that it's a given, that we do want a protocol to extend a jurisdiction of the court to cover human rights issues. But then again, the court already is interpreting, it's extending that, it's pushing the boundaries. So again, it will be interesting to interrogate whether advocating, mobilizing, seeking extension of the jurisdiction of the court formally in law, that is, would again be bane or boon. Could we actually be then pushing states into a corner, member states, and then suddenly they realize, aha, actually the way to address this issue is actually by pushing back. So in a sense, you would have an extension, but actually an extension whose effect will be to push back. So I just thought those are some of the issues which we need to keep in mind as we have this discussion. So again, I don't know if there are any hands up. But please,
Commissioner, if I may interject.
Go on. Yes.
So there is a recommendation from the second presenter, presented within the chat box. He explains that his presentation will be very much complementary to that of Selemani's. And so perhaps we may benefit both in terms of substance and time to have his presentation follow, and then we can have a joint plenary on both presentations.
Okay. Now. So then in that case, I think let's welcome Dr. Senola Horace Adjolohun, who, as Ibrahima said, presently is based at the African Court on Human and People's Rights. I should also say that I have worked with Horace at the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. So when you are trying to figure who might write compellingly on the AU human rights system and relating it to East Africa, since after all now he's based in Arusha, we couldn't think of a better person than him. So Horace, you're welcome. Please speak to us.
Commissioner, just before, thank you. I just wanted to remind you to turn on this video, but moving forward, I kindly request all panelists who are presenting to turn on their video. Over to you, Dr. Horace.
Vice Chair, and I want to thank the organizers of this event for giving me an opportunity to contribute. And thank you very much, Selemani. I want to take from where you stopped, possibly because the two topics are quite convergent and complementary. But let me say also, before I made my few remarks and my contribution, to say that I am speaking here today not in my capacity as a principal legal officer at the African Court, which is where I work currently, but I am speaking here as an independent, in my independent capacity as an academic. And so if I were to propose a paper as part of this project on what I'm requested to speak about, that is the East African Community member state as a focus of litigation within the African human rights system. I want to make a few remarks which could constitute basically the structure of my potential paper on this topic. So first of all, I may want to say that East African Community member state as a focus of litigation within the African human rights system could be construed or understood or talked about from a first standpoint of dilemma of adherence. Dilemma of adherence of, that is adherence of member state to the jurisdiction of the East African Community Court of Justice. And dilemma or even contrast, because if you compare adherence to the East African Community and to the Court of Justice of the Community, then you notice that compared to other regional human rights organs or institutions or bodies, you notice that whereas there is no special mechanism to adhere to the East African Community Court of Justice in terms of recognition of jurisdiction, just as is the case for the ECOWAS Court of Justice, you notice that for the other such similar bodies in the AU human rights system, such as the African Court on Human and People's Rights, but also the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, also the Banjul Commission, there are some minimum levels of recognition. The East African Community, if compared to the ECOWAS Court, do operate on the same basis of automatic adherence at entry point. That is, once you are a member of the intergovernmental organization that establishes those judicial bodies, then you also automatically recognize the jurisdiction of these bodies. Now, of course, with the African Court, you have what rather resembles the international framework for adherence to to such court, which is that adherence to the court is subject to a recognition, special recognition of jurisdiction. But again, here you notice that all EAC member states, which are also African Union member states, it doesn't make really a significant difference to them having to adhere to the African Court, for instance, subject to a special recognition of jurisdiction, because as a matter of fact, they do adhere almost systematically or universally to the Banjul Commission's jurisdiction, which allows litigants to go to the Banjul Commission and reach the African Court. Now, details about whether this is happening and how this is happening are other issues altogether. Number two is the issue of discontent and disengagement. Because when you are talking about litigating in systems like this, you have state adhering to the system, agreeing to the jurisdiction of the system, agreeing to the findings and orders made by the bodies and implementing them. And at some point, if you have engagement through adherence, of course, you contemplate disengagement and discontent. And in recent years, we have seen a lot of this, starting from the South African Community Court of Justice. Although the levels of discontent were quite different, we had some levels of discontent, state more or less attempting, I think Suleimani has raised this, attempting to curtail the operations of the bodies subsequent to some judicial lawmaking positions of the bodies. So now when you look at discontent and disengagement, it is never possible for a member state to withdraw from the jurisdiction of the East African Court of Justice, simply because this is not made possible by statute. So now the only way you can disengage from the East African Court of Justice, for instance, is you would disengage from the East African community altogether, because as mentioned earlier, both are tied. Once you step in, that is, you become part of the intergovernmental organization, then automatically you subject yourself to the jurisdiction and competence of all other bodies, including the Court of Justice. And now, again, you may want to consider that, for instance, with the African Court, it is allowed to step out, it is allowed to disengage. But again, this does not affect the political membership. And probably it is because it doesn't affect the political membership of the considered state to the umbrella organization, that is the African Union in this case, as far as the African Court is concerned, is probably because it doesn't affect that membership that the option is afforded to step out, to no longer recognize the jurisdiction of the African Court, but still remain as a member of the umbrella organization. Now, if you compare of the 6 member states of the East African community, 6 partner states, they are also part of the African Union, as a matter of fact. And as a matter of fact, also a couple of them have recognized the jurisdiction of the African Court. And this leads me to the next point. Point number 3 is the issue of mandate and jurisdiction. The issues revolving around mandate and jurisdiction. Now, if you take the Banjul Commission, the Arusha African Court, and the Children's Committee, that is the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, all 3 operate under the aegis of the African Union. Again, I've just said that all member states of the EAC are also members of the African Union, which operates the 3 other bodies, the Banjul Commission, the Arusha Court, and the now Maseru Children's Committee. Issues revolving around mandate and jurisdiction have to do with the fact that when you are dealing with the EAC member state being involved with the AU human rights system, you may want to think of the EAC not being subjected to any further arrangement or agreement. Now, many member states of the EAC who have subjected themselves automatically to the jurisdiction of the East African Court of Justice have had issues with the other regional bodies over the past 5 to 7 years. Some of them have challenged the jurisdiction of the Banjul Commission. We have had cases against Uganda before the Banjul Commission. We have had situations where Tanzania and Rwanda have gone up to withdrawing their recognition of jurisdiction from the African Court. Okay, so if you compare this, you wonder why the very same member states who have agreed to belong, to subject themselves to the jurisdiction of a particular regional court in respect of issues of governance, which have later been interpreted as issues of human rights, you wonder why they will be very happy to subject themselves to the automatic, systematic jurisdiction of our regional court, but not agree at the same time to the findings and orders of other, actually broader, and therefore possibly more powerful in terms of peer pressure and others, why they would now decline to subject themselves to the jurisdiction of other bodies such as the Children's Committee or the African Court. Issue number 4, it is only, so to say, a continuation of issue number 3. That is an expansion of the idea of if you have agreed to subject yourself to a lesser level of control in terms of governance, then you should normally agree to a higher level. And we have seen, despite the fact that states dispute the jurisdiction, human rights, so to say, of the East African community, they do participate in other similar adjudicatory processes in the continent. And there's ample case law to this effect. And we have not seen any dispute over the findings and orders against some EAC member states. I want to quickly recall here that before the African Committee of on the right web of the child, Kenya has agreed to subject themselves to the decision of the committee in case there was a which was never, so to say, to implement. Now, whether implementation has become a reality is another issue altogether. We are just saying here that they have agreed in the human rights jurisdiction of their closer regional integration judicial body. Before the African Court, Kenya has agreed to participate in the OGEC case up to the level of implementation of provisional orders and merit judgment of the African Court, and now currently pending reparation procedures before the African Court. And still Kenya is participating, and Kenya has never rejected the merit ruling of the African Court in the OGEC matter, and actually put in place, adopted the regulations and others, formed a body to take care of the outcome of the African Court. Same applies to Rwanda. In the case of Umoza, we had a judgment against Rwanda, mainly on the issue of freedom of expression, even if there's a denial of genocide in the background of the case. And then Tanzania has a handful of cases, a plethora of cases by the African Court. Yet Tanzania is also part to the EAC arrangement. And finally, before the Banjul Commission, we had the case of Kenya, again, subjecting itself to the jurisdiction of the African Commission in the Endoroi case and in some other similar cases. We have had Rwanda again in the freedom of expression case involving Nkusi and another. And you realize that all these cases were adjudicated by the other altar bodies in the continent without not so much rejection of recognition of jurisdiction of those bodies. Number 6, how do we now all these Banjul Commission, African Court, and East African Court of Justice? Now, in the statute, there is no such, but de facto, there is complementarity. One, there is normative complementarity. That is that the African Charter is recognized by all 3 intergovernmental organizations. That is actually all 2, both intergovernmental organizations. The African Union for the Banjul Commission, the Arusha Court, African Court, and EAC for the East African Court of Justice. All 3 intergovernmental organizations recognize the African Charter as an operating norm, supranational norm. So there is normative complementarity. There is also jurisdictional complementarity in the sense that the African Charter and some other regional instruments are recognized and applied by all three bodies: the Banjul Commission, the African Court, and the East African Community Court of Justice. So now here you speak also of, which raises also the issue of dilemma. Why do you agree to the jurisdiction of other bodies and limit yourself to the jurisdiction of similar bodies which are applying the same norms, and so on and so forth? And ideas about how do we strengthen and enforce all these mechanisms and norms at the regional and national level. I'm proposing that one, we go by a stronger national rule of law and democracy processes. One problem that it seems we've been having in Africa in terms of implementing effective regional human rights apparatuses, like putting in place those mechanisms and having them enforced properly, is that it seems we have been attempting to build concrete on top of bamboo. If I see some weaker mechanism at the lower level to receive stronger, if I may say so, because basically, and have them implemented. And this is where there seems to be an issue. As long as we do not strengthen the rule of law and democracy processes at the lower level, they will not be prepared to receive strong signals. And this is among the issues that are explaining why the supranational, very good, very well designed institutions are not operating properly, because they were built to harmonize and help enforce domestically. But how do you enforce using tools and processes that are weak? So that this will be one of the ways of thinking. Number two is to adjust litigation to domestic development, socio-economic and political development. How do you enforce the fruit of litigation where? One of the problems with international law is it's actually been asked whether it is law, properly speaking, because of the tools, proper tools of law. One of them is enforcement, use of force to impose the rule of law. So if we don't adjust litigation to domestic development, socio-economic development, so to say, there will be a gap between what we are attempting to do at the higher level and what is suggested should create local development at the domestic level. Three, incremental litigation through cross-cutting issues. This is another ways that the European and American, especially the inter-American system, which is much closer to Africa in terms of culture, in terms of history, etc. They've been doing incremental litigation. That is, instead of coming with a wholesale litigation on an entire section of socio-political question, they will divide it, break it into 2, 3, and go 3 years by sub issue, and that is desired by quickly to close. One thing that we may also want to bear in mind is to preserve the structure in litigating. So preservation of structures. How do we continue litigating, continue adjudicating without killing the structures? This is very important in an African context. And now we may want to be hesitant to this. We may want to play this difficult, but we have very young institutions. Frankly speaking, how do we deal with them and obtain the most possible, without necessarily endangering the actual system? Because the bottom line is, if we have no system, we cannot litigate. So it is not necessarily about on litigation. So we do not replicate the SADC tribunal scenarios, because so far we have not gotten back the SADC tribunal the way it was. Say that the global democracy crisis is let me be redundant, global. The democracy crisis is global. There's something called democracy crisis. It can have some African peculiarities, and I believe getting some of the regional integration mechanism in Africa, such as the EAC, to be more effective in terms of operation, it is also about the global crisis, the democracy crisis is coming from, and try to adapt African solutions. Now, the other issue is the issue of journalism. We are seeing that recently. Institutions are being doubted, institutions are being abused, and so on and so forth. And we see the resurgence of non-democratic behaviors and leadership and governance around the world, and a bit sensitive. But we cannot shy away from it. It's the issue of decolonizing institutional governance in Africa. We've been thinking, been working, preparing some reflections and publications around the issue. But I do believe that one major and cross-cutting governance issue in Africa is the issue of decolonization. It also is impacted by this sector of decolonization. How do we bring about genuinely African solutions that might have the potential of working better than the non-African approaches to it, including issues concerning human rights, governance, rule of law, and the others. So let me stop there. Those are some of the ideas that I intend on developing, reflecting on in the full paper that I am requested to prepare. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Horace, for that profound distillation of the issues which you would cover in the paper. I like the image of concrete on top of bamboo. Okay, so now let's give feedback, and then we are giving feedback to Mr. Kinyunyu and also to Dr. Adjolohoon, and the floor is open. So Martin, again, look for hands, raise hands, and then also we want someone should look out for comments on the chat box.
I'm terribly sorry to interject again, Commissioner, before the questions. It's just that I have my eye on the chat box in the background, and I just want to highlight we are facing a procedural challenge because of time. And we do have one more presenter, substantive presenter, Dr. Roongi, who might be leaving at the top of the hour. So my humble suggestion to the author and to you is that we will open the floor for very brief interventions, about 3 at the max I would recommend, and each would please have to be inclined to about a 30-second to 45-second intervention, and then you can post the rest of the questions in the Q&A chat box so that we can allow Dr. Roongi to at least intervene before the top of the hour, and then we would be able to know to proceed. I just wanted to put that out there.
It's already 10 to the hour, so perhaps the way to proceed, because I don't want us to get stuck in the process, perhaps the way to proceed is perhaps then to allow Dr. Roongi to speak, and then now we can get feedback for the 3 presentations, so that then definitely we'll have a record. If she must leave, we'll have a record, and also she'll be able to look at that. So perhaps my suggestion then would be, let's listen to Dr. Roongi. So, which means Dr. Mariam Kamunyu, I hope you're in the room. If you can then quickly speak to introduce that session, and then Dr. Roongi speaks. Then after that, we'll now have all the time we want in terms of speaking to the different issues, because now it will be about who wants to keep talking. Okay, so Mariam.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Commissioner Mote. Good morning, everyone. So glad to be here today and really enjoying the discussions. I think this is a really important conversation that we're all having. My name is Dr. Mariam Kamunyu. I'm an international human rights law lawyer. with a keen interest and focus on the African human rights system as well as its sub-regional mechanisms. It's my pleasure to introduce to us today Dr. Nkatam Roongi, who is going to be one of the authors of this project that KHRC has. I see somebody saying, finally, a female presenter. Dr. Nkatam Roongi is an advocate for the High Court of Kenya. She's a senior lecturer as well as an assistant director at the Center for Human Rights, which is within the Faculty of Law at the University of Pretoria. Dr. Nkata holds a Master of Laws from UP, University of Pretoria, and a doctorate from the University of Western Cape. Her research interests include African Union policy, African Union law, policy and institutional practice, the African human rights system, including the sub-regions, the protection and the rights of children, women, and persons with disabilities, and sexual and reproductive health rights. And she's known to me personally and a good friend. So very happy to welcome you, Dr. Nkata.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Mariam. It's a pleasure to see you and to reconnect to this platform.
Yes.
And sincere apologies to everyone for having to rush us. I got called up into something that I really have to go slightly after in the next few minutes. So I'm hoping that I can make the intervention, but that as the feedback comes, we'll at least be able to get that information from the recording. Then that will inform the final paper. So,
Dr. Nkata?
Yes.
A quick intervention. So do you then think that it's better for me to sort of pose some of the things that we already had in mind at this point before your presentation?
No, so I think I can make the presentation and then we can I'll get the feedback after, if you will.
Okay.
Or
Great.
If we have some time, you can also, maybe I can extend for a few and get the question.
Right.
Yes. So I was asked to reflect on lessons from other regional economic communities that the EAC could take in relation to protection and promotion of human rights. And I have to say that question itself, the framing of that question is very wide. I would certainly not have the time to go into each and every element of what I think would be lessons that we can learn. I also would say a lot has been said in the beginning, in the session starting right from the early morning sessions. And so as far as the role of the EAC, as far as the functions that the EAC institutions have been taking on, so I will not belabor that because I think it already gives us a basis on which to do a comparison. Because if I'm going to give good lessons or from other mechanisms, it's essentially a comparative. So already my comparator has been described, and so I'll depart from there. I think as you may have noticed from the discussion since the beginning this morning, we are leaning, because we are talking and having a conversation around human rights, which is definitely a legal subject, which has a lot to do with text, with normative text around the law. I mean, human rights text, as well as the institutions set up to defend this or to implement these frameworks, particularly the courts. So we are leaning more into those institutions and looking at how they operate. But it is important for us to keep in mind that human rights, as expressed in the normative framework, is certainly, obviously, implemented through the leadership of certain institutions, but it's also about issues that permeate other areas of the operations of regional economic communities. So I would take that perspective, the wider perspective of protection and promotion of human rights beyond the traditional institutions such as the courts, for instance. Also, just to put in perspective that there is at least 8 regional economic communities on the African continent. 8 of them, but traditionally, most of us, when we talk about regional economic communities, we are often only referencing the geographic, representations, which to a large extent only refer to, or not only, but mostly refer to the East Africa Community, the Southern Africa Development Community, SADC, and the West Africa Economic Community, which ECOWAS. But there is for instance, the Union of the Arab Maghreb Union. There is the ECAS, Economic Community of Central African States. There is COMESA, which is not geographic as the others are, is not based on geographic proximity exclusively, but rather more on purpose, as well as IGAD, that we can think of in that way. And there's also a much less known one, the Community of Saharan States. But as you hear them, you realize that they are tailored to purpose. Most of them are tailored to economic benefit. And that is why human rights is almost a secondary concern in the formulation of purpose, but is actually an integral part of the functions and the work that the communities do. So why do I bring this up is because, as has been said in previous statements, because regional economic communities are not primarily set up for human rights promotion, then you would have to think creatively to actually locate human rights within the operations of the regional economic communities. So while we now have a bit of clarity around how the courts, the East Africa Court of Justice, the West Africa Community Court of Justice, as well as the SADC Tribunal, which we are going to say SADC Tribunal in quotes at the moment because it's sort of suspended. Those courts, we have started to see how human rights has crept its way into their work. But the other elements of how the communities operate, maybe that is where we haven't looked so much. So because I was asked, the first question I was asked is to reflect around promotion of human rights. And one of the things that I would want to put out there is, if you listened or if you heard the presentations related to the EAC Secretariat or the Secretariat, people speaking from the Secretariat, there is a lot of reference to, there is in fact a lot of things being done about human rights, which is true, because when you look at the policies, if you look at the departmental arrangements and interventions related to various issues such as gender, such as protection of vulnerable groups, persons with disabilities, children, you find that there are policies that have been developed in agreement with the mandate of the institutions set up in the treaties. And those policies actually articulate a human rights agenda. And though they may not set up, they are not norm setting, but they set standards in relation to interpretation of norms at that level, at the level of the regional economic community. Specifically, let me give an example. For instance, in the EAC, you have the East Africa Community Child Policy, which I was involved in the development of. The East Africa Child Policy borrows, or rather puts itself within the context of the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, which, as the previous speaker has just mentioned, directly brings into the purview of the work of the REC a Pan-African instrument. So by extension, then member states are now recommitting themselves to implementing a human rights document that is adopted at the regional level. So we see that practice sectorally, so in matters to do, for instance, with health, and you can see very direct correlations and references to human rights, the right to health. You can see direct references to the rights of persons with disabilities in the EAC disability policy, and reference to the respective instrument that category of rights derives from. What does that say? Obviously, it doesn't make them justiciable necessarily, these instruments, but it does say, it does speak to a commitment from the partner states to those, to the agenda that is set out in those instruments. And the question is, how do we exploit that when you now want to seek accountability for implementation of human rights? Do we have to use the same language? Why do I bring that up? It's because if you look at the other RECs, for instance, that are not set up, again, for human rights protection, but even those that are sort of identical, similar to the EAC, such as SADC, you find that within SADC, one of the older instruments they have had is the SADC Gender Protocol, which is very much anchored in the rights of women in the Maputo Protocol, with clear references to in the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, as well as if you look at SADC model law on child marriage, SADC model law currently, I think, still under development related to violence against women, you see that there is a commitment towards human rights instruments, but not necessarily, you know, in the traditional sense that we want them in a normative, maybe binding instrument. The same way is you find that also within the ECOWAS community, the same similar kind of policy commitments, but not necessarily, you know, articulated in detail in the treaty itself. So there might be that there is a certain hesitance to say that, you know, RECs are set up for human rights protection in the binding document of the founding document of the respective community, but the practice of the community speaks a different language because the same states endorse those various instruments. And I'm talking about now, you know, the rights of women, persons with disabilities, and women, because that is the area within which I do research traditionally, and so I am privy to a lot of those documents. But actually, just, you know, if you sit with the instruments of all these communities, which I intend to do for the full paper, you find that this spreads beyond those vulnerable group sectors into other areas of rights that would be of interest to us, such as, for instance, rights in migration, protection from torture, and protection of other rights, such as, you know, bodily integrity and such. Okay, so the thing about this is the promotional side of things, but in the protection side of things, when you look at for instance, particularly the courts, I would start by saying at the Pan-African region, at the regional level, we have clear frameworks for accountability and for protection of human rights, where, for instance, states have to report on the implementation of these instruments. We don't have a similar regime at the regional economic communities, and therefore there is, I would say, a laxity of accountability for implementation of those policies. Again, remember, they are not necessarily binding, so it's a different level of responsibility than we would have at the regional level. But as far as courts are concerned, I think there is obviously a very peculiarly interesting example of how to do and what not to do. And I think we've heard a lot from Selemani and from Horace about, you know, litigation. And in as far as litigation is concerned, I think we have two main examples. One example of human rights litigation in an REC working very well, and I think that example is ECOWAS. If you go to the ECOWAS Community Court of Justice, ECOWAS has had so many cases, more than 100 cases over the years, and a lot of those cases, particularly in the recent past, have to do with human rights. And there is a progressive jurisprudence coming from these institutions, which the main difference between ECOWAS and the East Africa community is that ECOWAS subsequently amended its protocol to the court to actually include a human rights mandate that is expressed, as opposed to what you have within the EAC Court of Justice. So that is an interesting change that then makes this court an appropriate forum for litigation of human rights cases. The SADC tribunal is an example of how not to do it, because the SADC tribunal had leeways, or rather litigants were able to exploit the human rights mandate that is, you know, arises from the provisions of the treaty to bring cases to the court. And then, as was earlier said, one of the speakers mentioned it, the SADC tribunal then made a decision related against Zimbabwe in the Campbell case. And as a consequence of that case, there was political backlash, and Zimbabwe led a process of withdrawing individual access to the court. And because of that, an amendment to the protocol meant that now the SADC tribunal could only be accessed by states, which obviously means that human rights are no longer, will not be litigated before the SADC tribunal. And the tribunal has been defunct since then. It's been quite a while, several years, and process of litigating or urging states to, you know, to right this wrong has not been very, very successful. So there can be a serious consequence of political backlash when you have a country like Zimbabwe that pushes back. SADC tribunal is an example of that. And obviously we can hope that the EAC doesn't find itself there. There are certain safeguards that mean that it's unlikely that the EAC would find itself there. But I think that just the fact that you have a tribunal that once had a human rights mandate that could be utilized and was doing very well, and then that was reviewed by states as a form of political backlash is something that should give us thought for strategic engagement with partner states in the EAC in relation to the mandate of the EAC Court of Justice. So if you think of these things as a whole, I think one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that human rights there is the human rights from a very doctrinal, normative understanding of what the content is. But we as Lauren said earlier on, human rights is now interdependent with development. And there is a certain way that states are conceptualizing development and integration that brings human rights issues to the core of their function without necessarily explicitly saying that these are human rights concerns. So I think it's also important for us to engage with those other mechanisms that are not strictly the legal process, but policy and soft law, and see how those are impacting or how those can be exploited. For instance, I know that within that space, in the SADC region, in the regional economic, in the ECOWAS community, as well as the East Africa community, there is space for engagement for CSOs within if I would say, the soft law area, a lot of space for engagement and influence, which is not available within the hardcore institutions that are dealing with a norm setting and norm adjudication, such as the court and the respective parliaments. So I see my time has run out and I don't want to push it further, but these are some of the preliminary ideas that I am working with for the paper, looking beyond the traditional protection institutions to the full body of legislation, the full body of policy that the respective regional economic communities are engaging with, and looking at how that has the potential to influence the protection and promotion of human rights. I would say there are certain risks already that we see, and I think one of the main risks that we see, for instance, if you look at the work around the ECOWAS Court that has an explicit human rights mandate that imports instruments, regional instruments into its jurisdiction, is then you have a question of fragmentation of jurisdiction or of jurisprudence, because now you have different institutions that are looking at interpreting the same instrument. So, like as an example, the EAC asks states within the East Africa Child Policy to report on the implementation of the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. And yet the same states report to the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. And so you ask yourself, ultimately, according to the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, the committee is the body, is the treaty body responsible for its interpretation. How do you then, bring together, how do you ensure a judicial consistency without necessarily prescribing when you have many forums at different levels interpreting the same instruments? So those are some of the questions that I will be engaging with in the full paper, but I hope that is at least substance enough to allow for engagement at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Nkatam. Indeed, what you started by saying was my initial reaction when I first saw the title of your paper, Comparative Lessons and Good Practices from Other Regions in the Promotion and Protection of Human and People's Rights. I thought this is a mounting task. It's scoped very, very broad. And so I'm happy to hear that you're already considering some of the ways that you can delimit it. And I wanted, before I invite others, to share with you just some of the thoughts that I also had on this. And I have heard you mention, and I thought that one of the things you can do is completely omit the question of litigation from your paper, since that's very well covered in the others, and explore other pathways of accountability beyond litigation. Are there other ways provided that we are seeing that states can be held accountable beyond accountability, beyond litigation, I beg your pardon? And then in terms of good practices, in terms of normative standard setting and legislation, again, I see this already in your radar. You spoke, for instance, in terms of the SADC gender protocol, but what good practices are we seeing in terms of this REC setting up what are effectively model laws beyond them being enacted at this REC level? Are we actually seeing them making an impact in terms of what the domestic legislation looks like? So let's say if there's a prohibition of a certain practice, for instance, or criminalization of something, are we actually seeing the impact of that at the domestic level? And then something that I thought your paper could really take a strong angle on, and really it's the only paper that can do this, is a very strong engagement in terms of CSO engagement and sort of interacting with how has this been institutionalized. So for instance, we see in the case of the EAC, the consultative dialogue framework for CSOs is actually within the treaty, vis-a-vis what's the practice in this other area. So for instance, in SADC, we see very strong engagement of CSOs. What are some of the good practices here that East Africa CSOs can learn? And this is towards, because I noticed that this paper, the first objective is to mobilize CSOs across East Africa. And so essentially it's only your paper that can come with this angle. And I was thinking in this case, is there room, for instance, to do a bit of empirical legwork, just one or two key informant interviews to identify a really good case study that you could highlight? Is it useful because of how broad it is to, for instance, focus either on a specific rights area, like you're saying, an area where we are seeing a lot of rich development, and like you rightly said, for instance, in the area of women's rights, that could be an area to focus. We're seeing a lot of rich development there. What good practices are we seeing in terms of advocacy? How have civil society organizations been successful in other RECs, even within the EAC itself, in ECOWAS, in SADC? Are we seeing, a crystallization of what good practices look like for CSO engagement? And then if this would not be too much, I just wondered, at the end of the day, this discourse and all the discussions that we have really as human rights practitioners and defenders, it shouldn't really remain at this ivory tower or, normative level, but is there actually, and I wonder how we could find out this, are these norms, are these practices actually making their way to the core objective? The core objective of human rights norms, institutions, is to improve the lived realities of East African citizens, So is there any difference in the lives of East Africans, because we have this new norm, or the REC has issued a certain norm, the REC has issued a certain decision. Are we seeing, in a sense, whether citizens' lived realities are actually being changed? That last one I know is a bit of a stretch, but just we could perhaps hear your thoughts in terms of what you think in terms of that. And then maybe we can also have a few people raise their hands. Are there any good practices that you think Dr. Nkatam should pursue in particular? But Dr. Nkatam, you can perhaps be responding to that. Then other people can raise their hands or write in the chat.
Thank you, Mariam. I think most of it is comment, and I think I agree with you. As I said, I was being very quick because I only had 10 minutes, but these are some of the things that I've also already been thinking about. And the question of CSO engagement, I think the EAC actually, the framework, like you said, it's already there. There are questions about the inclusivity of the civil society space, which is not an EAC problem. It's probably even a wider problem at a Pan-African level with engagement with the African human rights system. Whether when you say CSO engagement, we actually mean space for the usual suspects, or whether we are talking about expanding the circle of who identifies as a CSO and what are they doing and what level are they engaging at? Is it national? Is it local? Is it regional? Those kind of questions may, for instance, be a basis on which we review, how, or rather it might be an interesting point of comparison in the sense that what we have, for instance, at the West Africa level, we have a very active WACSOF, West Africa Civil Society Forum, and WACSOF, being very structured and being, engaging at their respective countries and talking to CSOs at that level, then filtering the information up to the commission. You think that, that system, for instance, is inclusive, but even there are certain issues about inclusivity of the space. And within SADC, then you don't have a similar forum, but you still have, sectoral engagement, if I would say. So you have CSOs engaging in the gender space, you have CSOs engaging in the children space, but not necessarily a collective approach to engaging on human rights between CSOs and the respective body. So I think that is an interesting conversation. I wonder that we can, do all this within 6,000 words. I don't necessarily think we will be able to do it, but I'll try my best to cover as much as is possible. I certainly think that the question of whether it's having an impact at national level is harder to assess. I would say that it is possible, for instance, to just do a rapid appraisal of whether model laws find their way into national laws, whether, because that's the intention, whether they actually, if you have a model law on child marriage, which has been in existence since 2015, and it's now 2021, and the question is, has any Southern African country actually adopted a provision in their law or a national law related to child marriage? And if they have, did they take into account the model law? There's a bit of, empirical study that needs to be done into assessing the process of law development in the national level, but I think maybe we can look at a very cursory sense of whether this has been translated. Yeah.
Indeed, I agree completely. I see there are 3 questions. Can we hear from Abubakar Zain, followed by Dr. Sevanyana, and then Lillian, and then Bernard? If you could keep it to about 20 to 30 seconds, as Dr. Nkatam has to leave.
Maybe I'll then speak after she has left. And I also have to go for prayers, because I wanted to raise some issues also connecting to the other speakers.
Oh, okay. Can we take the questions for Dr. Nkatam only?
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
So
thank you.
Somebody else.
So can we hear from Dr. Sevanyana?
Actually, fear that hand has been raised for quite a while. You may have just forgotten to lower.
Okay, okay, Lillian, go ahead kindly.
Thank you. I've been really wanting to speak for a while now. I'm also in a hurry, so I'll try and be brief. My name's Lillian Alex. I work with the East Africa Civil Society Organizations Forum. I've been listening to the meeting from the beginning, and I've had the numerous issues that have been raised about the engaging the East African community on issues around human rights, specifically the role of civil society, what civil society can do. And I think at this point, since we're first of all sharing experiences, I just wanted to highlight the fact that the East Africa Civil Society Organizations Forum has been in existence since way back in 2007. And had the time not been too limited, I wish we would have given Mr. Maurice Taebwa more opportunity to elaborate, because he's the Civil Society Desk Officer at the EAC Secretariat, and he's the one who actually streamlines a lot of issues around civil society to the whole dialogue process, up to the Secretary General's level. I mean, we have a Secretary General's forum that happens annually. So I'll not take you into details on most of these issues, but I just wanted to highlight that there are legal recognized structures at the East African community level that recognize the space of civil society. Article 127 to 129 of the East African Community Treaty outlines a lot of issues around civil society engagement together with private sector. So
If you could come to your question.
I'm not having a question. I just wanted to share my comment before I leave.
Okay.
And I believe the 2 speakers before me have not spoken, so at least I can be given time to explain what I want to say.
Okay.
So yeah, so basically that is what I wanted to highlight and explain that the civic space in EAC is the structures have been put in place and are recognized. And yes, so basically the challenge that I'll just like to highlight, that is all that has been discussed since morning, is that there is need to see more vibrant civil society engagement. That one I agree with all of you. And we need to see how we streamline ourselves to first of all, use the existing spaces that we already have to voice our issues, voice our agendas, and the ongoing closure of the civic space in the East African region. That one I have to agree with you. And when it comes to human rights violations across the region, there has been a number of situations that we have also been faced with the same, given the closure of the civic space in the East African region. And we make the effort. And I like what one presenter mentioned, the issue around political will. And that way it brings me to the whole court, the whole the litigation that we were speaking. And I agree with also the panel, because I believe we're also speaking from the previous panel. We are reflecting questions from the previous panel. So I agree when the panel says that there is no, I mean, the EACJ, the East African Court of Justice, needs to expand its mandate to addressing the human rights issues that are happening in the region. That one I agree. But nevertheless, the litigations have also been done. We have tried at a number of times to actually put in cases with the court to see how we can try and, just raise the awareness, make the noise around there with the civil society, what is happening across the region. And we also still face the same challenge of the political will. It comes back to the national state. Every country, we're looking at Uganda right now, a lot is happening in a country, in Uganda. And as much as the civil society would push that one around to say, make statements, but again, we all go back to the political will where most countries, hide behind the sovereign. We are sharing experiences from the different tracks. And one thing I've also learned and following also.
Please conclude, Lillian. Lillian, I must urge you to conclude kindly. It's been 5 minutes.
Okay, so basically, I just wanted to also highlight that we are also going through the challenges that the civil society in East Africa region is facing, and we take note of the shrinking civic space that is happening across the region. And I just wanted to highlight that we are also coming up with a civic space operating environment bill at the East African level. And I think it's something that since we're having this discussion in this platform, these are also some of the areas that we can see how we expand on this opportunity to raise more of the awareness on issues around human rights, on the court mandates, and the engagement with the East African community. So I just wanted to raise that one. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Lillian. And I think instructive for Dr. Nkatam is that discussion there about the shrinking civic space. And I think that will fall perfectly within your discussion on CSO engagement. What does that look like now? What are the best practices? And I suppose also, how can we, for instance, come back or have a comeback in terms of the shrinking civic space? Bernard, is your question for Dr. Nkatam or your comment towards her paper?
Yes, please. And I will take about 30 seconds. I'll start from Mariam, the comment that you just raised. And Dr. Nkatam, thank you for the thoughts on the paper that you have provided. I was just thinking that, won't it be too much? Suppose we just have a separate paper on the efficacy and comparative analysis of the role of civil society organization, so that we can have a different paper doing a comparative analysis and telling us in which direction we need to go. And lastly, to you, Mariam, how do you expect the EAC to come together if we civil society can't come together? Thank you.
Go ahead, Dr. Nkatam.
May I ask a brief, sorry, Mariam, sorry to jump in. I should have raised my hand. Just a specific question for Dr. Nkatam. There's a discourse which says that filing cases, litigating cases, indirects, because now we're speaking about directs, is not so much about whether you win or lose, because then there are other benefits which may arise out of litigating in these regional courts, which actually in themselves can be extremely important in the final analysis, possibly around justice, possibly around mobilizing sectors. What's your comment on that? Thank you.
Okay, I think the last question is a bit more technical, and I have to apply my mind. Perhaps I have to think beyond East Africa for me to respond to the question by Lawrence. But the very first question relating to whether this paper can actually get to the point of discussing CSOs, I agree that there is actually, even if we I mean, in any subject matter, there is a lot that can go into a paper. I think we have to make some choices about the scope. But inevitably, in discussing lessons on engagement, particularly in as far as promotion of human rights is concerned, I think it will not be possible to discuss that without actually delving into the role of CSOs in the respective regional economic communities. Why? Because as I spoke with Mariam earlier on, or as Mariam pointed out, in as far as my paper goes outside of litigation, beyond litigation, into areas, particularly into the norm formulation, there is a lot of norm setting that is driven by CSOs, not just CSOs are contributing, but that is actually driven by CSOs at the REC level. And I think it's important that we assess those examples and see how ultimately that influences state response to implementation of human rights standards. I have in mind, for instance, the whole discussion around child marriage is very much CSO driven. In some circles, particularly in West Africa, you have CSOs having reference groups that directly feed into the work of the ECOWAS Commission and directly feed into the adoption of respective instruments related to these issues. So it's not something that we can ignore, and I think it's important to explore. I, however, agree with you that there is scope to actually have a whole focus on CSOs and another whole focus on other areas of work that needs to be assessed. The last question about litigation, I think it's not exclusive to, it's not unique to the RECs. It is actually more a feature of international litigation or litigating before international bodies, that the function often at times actually is hardly individual benefit for the claimant that is pursuing these causes, mostly because, as you know, by the time you come to these forums, you've already exhausted national remedies, and it's way after the incident has happened. There might be some justice, but it's ultimately not the only reason why we have these cases coming before the respective forums. It also has a wider and systemic response to violations function to it. And so one, developing the jurisprudence of the various mechanisms, because if you get the mechanism to engage on a particular issue, then you develop the jurisprudence around that area, and the clearer articulation is something you can carry back home to the national system and influence law formation, or law reform at national level. So it is true that that is one side of it. The other side of it, of course, is more political, in the sense that community, at least from what I have heard in my engagement with RECs, RECs are much more closer home than the African Union is. And because RECs are much more closer home, the issues are much local. Well, when I say local, I mean it's local than it would be with another state in another part of the continent. And so there is a sense in which the engagement in forums related to RECs is actually more nuanced to the respective challenges of that particular region, and that gives it gives particular value to jurisprudence emerging, because you understand the political dynamics involved. They are most likely common. You understand the cross-border issues that may arise in relation to issues. So they are appropriate forums for a contextualized discussion of an area that has a certain, a certain familiarity and proximity of issues. So that would be it sounds like a general answer, but I think that is a particular value of engaging REC mechanisms for litigation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Nkatam. I see one question from Ducho. Do you have time for that one? Yeah.
I'm sort of running with which one from?
Ducho, if you could keep it to 20 seconds for Dr. Nkatam, kindly.
I don't see any.
Ducho, go ahead.
Bernard, could you enable Ducho? Ducho, your mic is on mute. Huh? Lucho Thierry. Okay, he's not responsive.
Okay.
Over to you.
Great. Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Nkatam. I think you have a lot on your plate. And I think, Martin, if you're listening, you can hear there's a lot of appetite for this kind of forum. Towards Bernard's question, when he said civil society organizations, can't necessarily come together, I don't necessarily agree. We've met this morning, we've had 100 participants, clearly interested, listening. So I think perhaps what needs to happen with the EAC in particular is that the work there has been very much centered with the Arusha-based organization. So perhaps the challenge for you, Martin, and your colleagues at KHRC is maybe we can have another forum where CSOs can just come and ventilate issues. We can see what areas organizations can partner on, because clearly there's a lot of appetite for this kind of forum. So maybe you can have a parallel process separate from the book itself or the publications themselves. There's obviously people that are willing to contribute and give their views in terms of good practices, or perhaps even what would be the areas of priorities that can also further inform Dr. Nkatam's paper. Dr. Nkatam, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your excellent insights. We look forward to engaging with your paper. And hopefully all the attendees here, should you reach out to them, will be very cooperative. I imagine you may need to reach out to one or two to get a few sort of practical perspectives. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mariam. Thanks, everyone.
Did you have any final words?
Not really. I don't want to stretch it any further. It's been a pleasure listening to everyone, and I'm looking forward to working, to answering the rest of the issues later.
Indeed. Thank you. Thank you so much. Back to you, Commissioner Mute.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Nkatam. Thank you, Mariam. Moving on quickly. Now, Zain, I don't know if you've already gone for prayers because you wish to raise some issues. I see some of the other panelists may want to leave quite soon. So please take the floor and make your comments.
Thank you, Commissioner. A number of issues that I thought needed to be pointed out. The first one is in relation to how we implement the East African Treaty. There are three issues in terms of how generally we implement the treaty. One is through making law through IALA. The other one is to make protocols. And the third one is to make policies and executive directives. So there are challenges in terms of IALA law. The major one is it has to have assent by all heads of state for it to become law. But once it becomes law, it applies to all partner states. But if you do an analysis, you'll see that apart from the law making the budget, the Council of Ministers do not like to introduce any laws. So many of the laws are private members' bills, which have also limitations in terms of allocation of resources. Partner states like to use protocols because their construction of protocols and the understanding that they have adopted of protocols is it is one, an extension of the treaty, but two, it is implemented by partner states. So it's not implemented by the community. Protocols are not implemented by the community, but they're implemented by partner states. And partner states have wide discretion in terms of how to implement and how quickly to implement. But also in terms of policies and executive decisions, as one of the speakers noted, the question of justiciability of the policies comes into play, and also partner states don't take any of those policies seriously, and there's nobody to implement it at a global level. the second point I wanted to make is in relation to implementation of the treaty. If you look at Article 8, 4, and 5, 4 talks about community organs, institutions, and laws shall take precedent over similar national ones on matters pertaining to the implementation of this treaty. And then 5, in pursuant of this provision, the partner states undertake to make necessary legal instruments to confer precedence of community organs, institutions, and laws. Again, we have a big problem there. And I think that needs to be examined a little bit, because if you take examples, not all partners states have established these legal instruments. But if you look at two different approaches, one by Rwanda, which is through ordinary legislation, and one by Kenya through locating this in the Constitution, Article 2, Clause 6. If you do it through ordinary legislation, then whatever you do at the community still falls under the constitutional framework of the partner state. And that creates a lot of problems. Then very quickly, we need to keep our eyes on the constitution making process in the community, because it will answer some of the issues that we are raising. And then next is the question of decision making in the community. When we are talking about decision making in the community, there are 3 issues that bog down implementation of the treaty in the community. One, consensus have been interpreted by practice in the community to mean unanimity. So if there is one partner state that does not agree, that matter is dead. And nowhere else in the world do you take consensus to mean unanimity. The second one is a related matter of quorum. We have also set a precedent where quorum means every person present, every partner state present. So if a partner state is not particularly happy about a human rights issue or an issue, they simply don't turn up for the meeting. And then the meeting cannot take place. People forget that the budget of the community is only about $10 million US. $10 million US. So our aspirations are much more progressive than the practice. And then let me finish by saying that when we talk about visioning, and a number of times people have raised the issue of Vision 20, the African Union Vision 2063, people forget that there's an ESC Vision 2050. And hardly do we discuss these matters, even about human rights. How much have we catered for human rights in the Vision 2050? And let me finish by reminding people again that Article 145 in relation to a partner state wanting to leave the community has not been operationalized. Suspension of members have not been operationalized. And lastly, expulsion of members have not been operationalized. Thank you very much, Commissioner, for your indulgence.
Thank you, Zain. So what we do, I think we still need to give a little more feedback. So Martin, do we have hands? I know we need to come to a conclusion quite quickly, but are there any hands which are up at this point?
We have one hand up, Commissioner, and that's Mr. Bernard Oundo, the President of the East African Law Society.
Okay, Mr. Oundo. And then we'll quite soon we'll have to finish. So Andrew, if you see anything else on the chat, please tell me, so that then after Mr. Oundo, we'll decide how to proceed. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you, Lawrence. I will be very brief. I think I have 2 comments on the presentation that was made. I can't remember the presenter, but this issue around whether you require a protocol on human rights. I think it's an issue that needs to be investigated, especially considering the timing and where we are. and also looking at the jurisprudence of the court. Is there a position where someone has gone to the court and has actually not have, and the court has actually said we don't have jurisdiction on anything to do with enforcement of human rights? I think those are questions that would like to see the one writing the article look at. The other issue really is about the judges at the ESCJ. As many of you know, they still continue to hold positions at the national level. Is it time for us to have these appointments so that they are permanent, so that when you are appointed, you are actually permanent at the ESCJ? So that also that helps also dealing with the backlog of cases that we see now at the ESCJ. Is that also something that can be discussed in that article that will be written? Lastly, again, my call and just looking at the experience I've had at the East Africa Law Society, as civil society, we need to do everything we can to strengthen IACSO, the East African Civil Society Organization. We need to do everything we can, because all these issues that we are discussing, if we have a strong body, and you can look at it from the perspective of the East Africa Law Society. I mean, if you look at the East Africa Law Society, because we are composed of all the 7 bars, when we speak with one voice, and therefore we can be able to move certain things. I appreciate the points around political will. Those are, of course, challenges, but can we do something fast as civil society? Can we come together and strengthen that IACSO and fund it so that we have one voice? Thank you again to Kenya National Human Rights, and thank you, Lawrence, for the opportunity. Asante sana.
Thank you.
Commissioner, I would suggest we have really extended into the time we had allocated for the webinar. So I'll just suggest, I do recognize there are quite a number of questions in the chat box and the Q&A. We will definitely collate those questions. I'm sure the host, Kenya Human Rights Commission, will work to collate those questions, and we will then direct them to the relevant authors who are presiding over the different themed papers, and that way the issues will be engaged with. I also recognize that the panelists on litigation have actually also extended their time significantly and do need to take their leave. So maybe at this juncture, you can give them an opportunity to make some brief closing remarks, and then we can move to ending the session.
So indeed, in the nature of webinars of this type, people speak a lot. So apologies, Kinyunyu, Horace. I should call you Horace. So please, Selamani, just speak to us in conclusion. There may be certain things you picked up which you wish to reflect on, and then after that we'll have Horace speaking, and then now we can conclude this part of the convening. Selamani.
Thank you very much, Commissioner and colleagues. Again, I think a really fascinating conversation this morning. I think on the issues directly related to the paper, most of them are comments. I've taken note, and I will definitely make sure to incorporate them as much as possible, bearing in mind, obviously, the space constraints. I think the one thing that I would like to say, if I may, which is a little bit off topic, but I think quite relevant, is, I'm continually reminded of the words of one of the great Pan-Africanists of our time, Tajuddin, who said, "Don't agonize, organize." And I think President Oundo has said it best. Many of the challenges that we are facing around, human rights in the region, the ineffectiveness of our institutions, many of these solutions have already been documented. So it's really about us just rolling up our sleeves and getting things done. And if we have that sort of, action-oriented mindset, I think we can try and push things forward. But apart from that, it's thank you very much once again to the organizers, and I'm wishing everyone a safe and pleasant weekend.
Thank you, sir. Horace.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Vice Chair. I don't think I have much to say at this junction. I think I've taken note of the comments that were made. So I would probably say see you at the point where we have an opportunity to discuss the papers. But thank you very much again for inviting.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you so much for participating in this and actually bringing extremely invaluable contributions. So both yourself and Dr. Selamani and earlier Dr. Lando and Nkatam Roongi. And of course also to the facilitators. I'm saying thank you because at this point, I want to hand it back to Kenya Human Rights Commission. I think what will happen is that now there will be a summing up and then there will also be a way forward. And the Kenya Human Rights Commission is leading that process, I believe. Take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. I will now invite Andrew Songo to do the summing up. Andrew?
Okay, thank you, Martin. Thank you, Commissioner Mute. And of course, especially thank you to all the speakers, panelists, facilitators who've engaged, and most substantively to the participants who've raised very rich, incisive questions and made this a very lively discussion. It's not lost on me that we are almost an hour over what we had estimated for this discussion, but I'm also very pleased to note that if you look at the attendance, it has been consistent throughout the discussion. I think this is testament to how valuable this discussion the Kenya Human Rights Commission has convened really is. I will not pretend to summarize the discussions or give a Hansard reporting of what has been discussed. I will just tease out a few key issues that I think have emerged from this discussion and that will be synthesized further by our authors as they prepare their papers under the themes that Commissioner Lawrence Mute highlighted for us at the beginning. I think based from everything we've heard from the spectacular keynote by Brian Kagoro, the very insightful background that we were given by Honorable Zain Abubakar, and then also the paper abstract by Dr. Lando, we can satisfactorily say that the East African Community Treaty does place human and people's rights within the integration agenda. But as Dr. Lando referenced, we do need to move away from the acknowledgement of this human and people's rights agenda from being what he called a stock phrase into translating it to becoming actual reality. And a lot of that has to do with what I feel Brian Kagoro eloquently put us through. It involves taking stock of the landscape of operation within the East African community. And that means recognizing the regional trends and threats towards the protection of human and people's rights. And it also means we need to take up the existing statutory spaces of engagement within the East African community, because they do exist, though imperfect in some ways. And we also do need to take up the spaces that are invited for us as civil society to engage within the area. To do that effectively, we also then need to strengthen the human rights movement collectively in the region, as Brian was eloquently taking us through. And that means beyond just talking about setting up civil society organizations in the formal sense, it means also breaking down the social barriers and silos that exist within our understanding of promoting and protecting human and people's rights. So you remember he talked about the different classes, breaking down the elite conception of human and people's rights and making sure that we have a very wide-based constituency of advocates for the promotion and protection of human and people's rights. It means also strengthening the rule of law mechanisms at all levels. And this means, as Honorable Zain Abubakar took us through, the financial and operational independence, not just of the East African community organs, but also of the national organs, as Dr. Mogesa of the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights highlighted for us. It means independence and financial and operational independence of our national judiciaries, our national human rights institutions, and also other access to justice mechanisms at the most local levels. When we come to the issue of litigation, I think Ibrahima set the stage very well by reminding us that beyond looking at the judgments that you can obtain from a court at any level, litigation can be a tool of advocacy and dialogue, not just with the state, but with the society at large, by illuminating key human rights concerns that should be able to be of common seizure of the society, and therefore we move forward by providing redress to victims. Litigants do play a critical role in enlivening the human rights concerns and inviting in innovative interpretation. And this example we've seen in what Soleimani described as the expanding jurisdiction of the East African Court of Justice to include human rights through the jurisprudence the court raised. There would be no such jurisprudence from the court if we didn't have robust activist litigation that sought to expand the imagination of how the EAC treaty can be interpreted. Litigation, in that sense, therefore, needs to be responsive to the socioeconomic dynamics and concerns of the society. What we bring before the court as public interest litigation, as human rights litigation, has to be substantive and relevant in terms of actually responding to the plight and the concerns of the wider public. With regards to how to succeed and to approach litigation, I think one of the key salient features of successful litigation at this level was highlighted by Horace when he pointed out to us that perhaps because of the immensity of the human rights concerns that the region has, an incremental progress, and we can continue to build on the progress that we get from progressive jurisprudence. Finally, with regards to comparative analysis, there's a lot that Dr. Roongi has covered within the presentation of our prospective paper. But I would just want to highlight some of the key features of some of the things you said, such as the need for regional economic communities to move from norm development to norm implementation. We've seen the numerous protocols, the general comments, and other instruments that have been propagated that do speak to human and people's rights concerns, but now we need to move to strengthening the aspects of implementation. And so in that regard, we need to also open up our eyes and have a more expansive approach to the notion of accountability or protection of human and people's rights. And one key area or illustration she made to this point was the aspect of peer-to-peer accountability. So within the African Union system, for example, you have the African peer review mechanism, and the question then becomes, what can we propagate in that similar fashion at the regional economic community level, specifically within the EAC? But that even as we look at these different platforms of accountability and we expand our thinking and understanding of spaces of accountability and protection, these multiple platforms of accountability and protection should in fact yield complementarity between each other and not fragmentation of the obligations that states hold with regards to the promotion and protection of human and people's rights. So it would be more interesting to see how we can make sure that there's complementarity within the judicial and quasi-judicial mechanisms, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, the African Court on Human and People's Rights, vis-a-vis the East African Court of Justice. If we can imagine an African peer review mechanism type of mechanism at the REC level, how will they interact with each other? So that we make sure that all the cumulative work that is done by these institutions serves to advance the cause of making human and people's rights tangible in the lived reality of the citizenry. And then, of course, the overriding issues that attach to that, all these different themes, has been enhancing the role of civil society in driving this agenda, making it a people-led agenda, and harnessing or trying to make sure that we harness the requisite level of political will to make sure all these normative aspirations do turn out to be tangible, lived realities for the citizenry of the East African community. And so with that, I would again like to appreciate us all for engaging in this very lively discussion and providing very rich input that will then go in to the development process of the the papers that are being done within this project. And I will therefore now yield the floor to KHRC's Annette Nerima to discuss the way forward and essentially send us all on our way. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And I think in the interest of time, I'll not take a lot of time in doing the way forward and also the vote of thanks. So from here, the respective authors will do the detailed papers, putting into consideration input from this discourse. This will subsequently form the or even result in the compendium issue, which will be published by KHRC in about in 3 months. That should be around May, and the same will be shared with all of us here and also the larger public once ready. It is a privilege to deliver the vote of thanks and also acknowledge the contribution of those who have worked tirelessly to make this vital convening possible. And on behalf of the Kenya Human Rights Commission, I want to extend our sincere thanks to all our speakers, facilitators, and participants present for making today's webinar convening a success. And to our speakers, Mr. Davis Malombe, Mr. Bernard Oundo, Dr. Bernard Mogesa, Honorable Zain Abubakar, I know he's left. But today we have had an opportunity to hear your valuable thoughts, which I believe and will go a long way in enhancing this process. And also today we had a panel of experts, and I would like to thank you very much, Mr. Lawrence. I know you had so many responsibilities today. I would also want to thank Mr. Brian Kagoro, Dr. Victor Lando, Mr. Suleimani Kinyunyu, Dr. Horace, Dr. Nkata Murungi, Mr. Andrew Songa, for honoring our invitation to be part of this webinar convening, and also for your deep intellectual and worthy opinions on the subject matter. We really appreciate your efforts for making the webinar an informative one for all of us. I mean, this was really insightful conversation. We also had today a great team of facilitators. We had Mr. Ibrahima Khan, Dr. Miriam Kamunyu, and also Mr. Lawrence, I know I've mentioned because he really had so many responsibilities today. We thank you very, very much for excellently leading us in the different sessions of this webinar. Last but not least, I would also like to thank participants and respective representatives from the East African community, civil society organizations, the human rights defenders, and even the development partners, the East African Law Society, for making time to attend, and also your presence and also active participation during the webinar. Importantly, an event like this cannot happen overnight. And it takes a lot of planning and also commitment and commitment. And for that reason, I would like to thank the KHRC team led by Mr. Davis Malombe, Martin Mavenjina, Moses Gowi, Bernard, and myself for proactiveness and also dedication in putting this meeting together. And with that, we have come to the end of the meeting, and I just want to wish us all great afternoon, and thank you so much for making time to be here. Asanteni, and bye.